Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, the year was 1984 and 10-year-old Edward Barry stared out of his bedroom window, completely lost in his own thoughts, as the rain bucketed down. There was something extremely soothing about the rain pelting against the roof. It calmed down the hunger pangs that were building up inside his stomach, to such an awful extent that he was dreaming of crispy fish fingers and French fries. And the more he salivated about such a mouth-watering delicious meal, the more his stomach began to cramp up. He realized he was drooling. Edward had never known hunger like this before. He felt as if his insides were eating themselves up alive. His hunger was insatiable. Edward had told his mother he was hungry at lunchtime, after he'd been dropped home from school by their kind neighbour, Mrs. Weinstein. Edward's mother, Julia Barry, was distracted by her two screaming 6-month-old twins that she had snapped at Edward furiously and told him to go straight to his bedroom. Well, actually, it would seem she had screamed at him so hysterically, to such an extent that Edward had jumped out of his skin from the shock of his mother's angry retort. Edward had never known his mother to become so outraged. Her nostrils had flared, her lips had curled up into the ugliest scowl that he had ever seen, and for a brief second he was sure her eyes had gone completely white, so that his mother looked as if she was demon-possessed. Things had been so incredibly different in the Barry household before the fortuitous arrival of the twins, and back in those days things had been very good, for Edward's mother, Julia, had lavished an extortionate amount of attention on her beloved 10-year-old son. Indeed, back then, not a single day had passed by when Julia Barry hadn't tucked Edward up in bed lovingly and told him how much she adored him. She would read him a thrilling bedtime story every single night. Those nostalgically delightful days seemed like a wistful passing memory, for there had been laughter and merriment in the Barry household. Indeed, back then, not a day had passed Edward by when his mother, Julia Barry, hadn't devotedly tucked Edward up in bed and told him how much she loved him and read him a thrilling bedtime story. Those nostalgic, delightful days seemed like a wistful passing memory, for there had been so much laughter and merriment in the Barry household. Indeed, Edward had been so deliriously happy, but looking back, he only began to appreciate how good things really had been then. So he could not help but harbour a growing sense of resentment towards his two 6-month-old twin sisters, Georgia and Eleanor, as once they had come along, things had never been the same again. But little Edward knew he couldn't blame his sisters for his mother's cantankerous attitude these days. Edward's father, Wayne, seemed to dread returning home on an evening, and even when he parked his car in the driveway, he'd often sit there for ages staring into space, as if bracing himself to actually come indoors, like someone who is very reluctant to jump in the ocean in case they get eaten alive by the sharks. Gone was the warm, devoted, cheery smile on Wayne Barry's face when he entered the house, barely even acknowledging or greeting his own wife. Instead, he would mutter a half-hearted hello, and would hurriedly retreat to his study, where he'd seek refuge and would lock the door quietly behind him, something he'd never been privy to doing before. The only time he'd make a somewhat beleaguered appearance was when hunger finally got the better of him, or when he decided to look in on the twins, or to seek Edward out to see how he was doing. But he did his level best to avoid his wife as much as he possibly could, so they soon became like two passing ships in the night, for they had very little contact with each other. Wayne Barry would often spend the night in the spare bedroom, claiming he didn't want to disturb his wife, for she needed her beauty sleep. Wayne Barry's increasive evasive behaviour towards his wife Julia got progressively worse, and only served to heighten and exacerbate the unrelentless arguments in the Barry household that had become increasingly more fiery. Edward's mother was always tirelessly complaining to Wayne that he was never there for the family, and on 2 separate occasions she had practically accused him of having an affair with his secretary at the office in town, which would have been strange and rather unorthodox, for the woman in question was old enough to be Wayne's mother. But that didn't appear to stop Julia from accusing her husband of treacherously indecent behaviour, which Wayne Barry had adamantly denied. "I know you're having an affair with Sonia Ewing," she would say, spitting at her husband contemptuously, to which Wayne would almost laugh and say, "Don't be ridiculous, love. Where on earth did you get that insane idea from? My secretary is old enough to be my mother. She has purple hair, wears tortoiseshell glasses, and if I had to have an affair with someone, it wouldn't be her. I'm not attracted to purple hair, or to women that could have actually given birth to me." "It's all in your head, love," he would say, lashing out at her in return. "Why do you think so badly of my character? I'm a man of integrity, that sticks to his marriage vows. Surely you know that I wouldn't cheat on you, Julia." Julia would respond defiantly, with hands on hips, and she'd glare at her husband with indignant daggers for eyes that became almost reptilian. They looked as if they could pierce through bone, marrow, and sinew, for they became almost menacing. "All right," said Wayne Barry, raising a hand to appease his wife. "I'll level with you, Julia. Can you blame me for not wanting to come home? If you want to know the bitter truth, I'll spell it out to you plainly. I dread coming home to you. That's why I'll often sit in the car and read a newspaper, because it takes me a lot of energy to pluck up the courage to get into the house. If the truth be told, love, I feel as if I'm sharing a house with a temperamental female grizzly bear that is always volatile and unpredictable, and is usually in a cantankerously pugnacious mood, and is eager to launch an attack on me the moment I walk through the front door. Let's just say if I say anything that rubs you up in the wrong way, anything that upsets you, oh boy, do I know about it. I feel as if I'm walking on eggshells with you, love, these days. Nothing I ever do is right, nor is it good enough. Ever since the twins have come along, you've changed exponentially in more ways than I can ever count. You're not the person you used to be, and I want that wonderful woman back that I idolized so much. Where did she go?" Julia Barry had been furious at her husband's candid retort. She had launched an attack at him like a rabid dog, foaming at the mouth. She had unabashedly slapped her husband across the face, something she'd have never dreamed of doing before. And when Wayne Barry had been hit, his eyes had widened in disbelief, because these days he genuinely did not recognize the woman he loved so much. Indeed, he didn't even like Julia anymore, but he kept these thoughts privately to himself. Julia's 2 best friends, Angie and Lisa, who would visit her on Tuesdays and Fridays for tea, never returned to the house again, which in itself was decidedly odd, for Julia had been very close to her 2 girlfriends, and Wayne Barry noticed even they appeared to have distanced themselves from her. So he knew very well he wasn't imagining the startling changes he had seen in his wife's personality, for other people seemed to feel it too. Julia would spend countless hours on the phone talking to her sister Natalie, her mother Ruby, and of course her 2 best friends. But these days the phone never rang in the Barry household, for no one appeared to want to speak to Julia anymore. Even at 10 years old, Barry had to agree with his father on this one. Something was seriously wrong with his mother. Even on a recent dental appointment, where Edward had accompanied his mother to the surgery, and sat waiting for her patiently in reception. He had been visibly disturbed to learn that his mother's dentist, Dr. Greenberg, whom she'd been seeing since she was a little girl, had thrown her out of his surgery and told her never to come back again and to find for herself another dentist. "The man is pathetic," Julia Barry had complained in the car on the way back home. "I can't believe he had the audacity to throw me out of his surgery like that." But the dentist's grandson, a boy called Errol Greenberg, who happened to be in Edward's class at school and was good friends with Edward, had confided in him that his mother, Julia Barry, had growled at his grandfather like a vicious, very dangerous dog when he'd worked on her teeth, and then suddenly he'd bitten one of his fingers so hard when he'd tried to investigate the decay between two of her teeth that he'd bled quite badly and had gone off to the hospital not only to have stitches but a tetanus shot as well. This revelation had naturally horrified little Edward. His mother was slapping his father across the cheeks, biting the dentist, and become estranged from her friends. What would his mother do next, he wondered. It would seem Julia Barry was quickly turning people against her, left, right and centre, including Edward himself, of course, and his father, Wayne Barry. 10-year-old Edward had grown increasingly afraid of his mother of late, especially when her eyes would suddenly become cloudy and white, a look he'd seen on a woman called Zara Witchen, who had visited their house once for tea, and it had scared the bejesus out of him. Now he was seeing the same look on his mother. In the old days, she had been a sweet, nurturing, kind spirit, but now Julia Barry was volatile and as combustible as Mount Etna in Italy, for anything would set her off into a fiery tangent of indignant rage that was almost unquenchable, rather like a Californian wildfire that you couldn't easily put out. It didn't help, of course, that the Barry household was never peaceful or serene these days, for ostensibly Edward's two twin sisters would scream tirelessly. Julia Barry tried to comfort them, but they'd wail all the more, as if they themselves were affronted by their own mother's demeanour, for she seemed to scare them as much as she was scaring little Edward these days. Julia Barry had turned on her husband Wayne, after he'd told her some unsavoury truths about how she had changed of late. She reared up at him like a contemptuous viper. Her brown eyes became distinctly yellow, like that of a reptile. Even the way she moved her body reminded little Edward of a snake. "You think I've changed, do you?" said Julia, as she addressed her husband, with eyes blazing incandescently. "You would change if you were trapped in a house like this day after day, with a multitude of chores to do, as well as looking after 3 very demanding children. Do you have any idea how hard I work looking after 2 babies and 1 10-year-old? The twins cry all the time, non-stop, demanding my undivided attention. Edward is always wanting to be fed, almost as if he's got a bottomless pit for a stomach. I'm permanently exhausted, Wayne, but you have no comprehension what it's like for me to be a full-time mother. It's all right for you, Wayne. You have it so damn easy, don't you? You go off to your cushy job in the city, where you're insulated from the demands of daily life here at home. You don't have to concern yourself with dirty diapers and the screams of 2 babies. It's absolutely exhausting and very debilitating looking after both the twins. I feel as if I'm on a merry-go-round all the time. They won't stop crying, but you never lift a finger to help around the place. You were the one that wanted these babies, but now I'm the sole carer for the both of them. For you just bugger off, and when you come home, you storm off to your study, locking the door behind you, and I don't see you until you want something to eat." "Love," said Wayne Barry, "this is not about the twins. You know it. You're right. I should help you around the house more, but I don't like interacting with you these days. We always end up fighting. I'm a pacifist. I hate arguing. You just changed, love. A light has gone off in you. You're not the person I married. That's all I'm saying." Edward's parents' arguing voices would go on, and their angry flare-ups would beat against the Barry house, louder than the raindrops that were currently pounding against the roof. There were times that their fighting would be so intense that Edward would block out their voices by placing his hands over his ears. He didn't want to listen to them arguing again and again, and fighting like a couple of angry Rottweilers that were going for each other's jugulars. Edward could barely recognize his life anymore, for everything had changed exponentially in the Barry household, and not in a good way. Edward could sense a tangible, very clandestine darkness was spreading over the household like a festering mold that was draining the air of all the oxygen and filling the house with an oppressive, profound sense of heaviness. He was sure his twin sisters could feel it too, which would explain why they cried all the time. Up until the twins were born, Edward's father, Wayne Barry, had been devoted and really loving towards his wife and, of course, his son Edward. There had been no doubt in young Edward's mind that for the first 10 years of his life his father had absolutely adored his mother, idolizing her like some people might put their favourite film star on a pedestal. Even Julia Barry's own friends envied the relationship that she had with her husband, claiming that she had found for herself in Wayne a keeper because the man adored her so very much. In those fun-loving, carefree years, Edward's father Wayne had remained smitten over his wife, declaring himself to be the luckiest man in the entire world. He'd always tell little Edward how he had hit the jackpot in marrying his mother, and how blessed they were to have each other. But nowadays the sullen, very sombre, heavy mood in the Barry household could not have been more tense, for it had been contaminated by a sense of growing disquiet, almost as if an unforeseen darkness had been slowly but surely creeping across the household and very ambiguously sucking away the serenity that had once been so much a part of Edward's young life. Where had all the joy gone to, Edward wondered to himself, for he had not seen his parents dote on each other for a long time, as they once had done so. These days he might as well be a fly buzzing around on the window-sill, as the only time his mother ever appeared to notice him was when she wanted to swat him away, and she was increasingly forgetting to feed him, so that young Edward was dropping so much weight that even some of the teachers at his school had expressed their alarm. One had actually phoned Julia Barry, who had told the teachers that of course Edward was eating, and no, nothing was wrong with her son. Edward tried to think when the trouble had first begun, and when things had turned sour like milk in the refrigerator that suddenly goes off and begins to curdle and doesn't smell too great. It all started when his mother Julia had announced to her husband Wayne and to Edward that she was pregnant. The news had made Barry's father very ecstatic. Indeed, Edward had never seen his father look so animated before when he was told this life-changing news, for the Barry family had always wanted to be a big one. Wayne's eyes had lit up like a Christmas tree, and his expression had become one of wondrous awe, as he looked at his wife adoringly, almost as if she was some kind of angel of light that had answered one of his biggest, most important wishes. "You're having twins? This is the best news ever, love. I can't believe you're pregnant, Julia. This is a wish that we've always wanted for ourselves. We thought... "I know what we thought," Julia Barry had said excitedly. She reached out to affectionately stroke Wayne's day-old shadow on his chin with her long fingers, staring adoringly into his eyes. "We thought I could never have any more children, didn't we? I mean, we've been trying for the last 10 years or so to be able to have a brother or sister for little Edward over here. And then I get pregnant like this, just like magic, with a little tweak here and there. It looks like a miracle has erupted in our lives, Wayne, and I, for one, could not be happier. As you know, I've wanted children as much as you have. We've always wanted a big family." "It's a miracle," said Wayne Barry, his voice alive with a pronounced cheer. "Did you hear that, young Edward?" said his father, turning around to look at little Edward, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a toy truck tucked away in his hands. He had been listening to his parents' conversation with an expression of bewilderment on his face, as he was trying his level best to digest the startling news of what he'd just heard. His mother was having a baby, and Edward wasn't sure how he felt about this, for he knew their introduction into his life would bring about many changes, and he wasn't sure about change. He liked things just as they were, him, his mother, and his father against the world. But now, in the not-too-distant future, there would be another family member. "You're about to have a little brother or sister, Edward. Did you hear what your mother was just telling me?" said Wayne Barry exuberantly. "Your mother is pregnant. Isn't that exciting? I know how you've always wanted a sibling, and now your dream has been answered, as has ours." Edward had not known exactly how to react to this earth-shattering news. At 10 years old, he liked being the centre of his parents' world, and now that attention would be divided, with him and another sibling, rather like a packet of candies, and he wasn't sure how he felt about this. He had become used to being an only child. Now he knew that there would be significant changes on the horizon of his life, and little Edward didn't like the taste of change, for it invited in him a feeling of uncertainty that he simply could not shake off. Maybe even in that poignant moment of time, Edward had a sense of knowing that from thenceforth his life would never ever be the same again. When Edward was between the ages of 3 and 5, he had certainly expressed a desire to have siblings, but now with the baby's ominous arrival on the horizon of his life, he knew things would be profoundly different. For a start, there would be a noticeable 10-year age gap between him and his sibling, so he doubted that they would have much in common. It was true he'd always wanted a sibling, but later when his mother had announced that she was expecting 2 twin girls, that was a bit of a bummer for Edward. He couldn't help but feel a tad disappointed. He would have liked very much for one of the twins to have been born a boy, even with a noticeable age gap between them, for they would still have had something in common, and he could have taught his brother many things. He might have enjoyed the part of being a big brother, but girls were a different kettle of fish altogether. Edward believed girls were sissies who loved to play dress-up with their mother's clothing and walk around with dolls in their arms, and never really getting their hands dirty. On the day his mother had announced she was pregnant, Edward had no way of knowing back then that she was carrying twin girls. He had managed a half-hearted smile that didn't meet his young, curious brown eyes. For a moment he'd stood there stoically in the doorway, his toy truck almost slipping out of his hands, almost as if his fingers were smothered in butter. For a brief moment he watched his ebullient parents dancing across the kitchen floor excitedly, doing all kinds of rather exotic dance moves, as they were so lost in each other and in that treasured moment of having their dreams now fully realized. "Mrs. Julia Barry," his father had said, throwing his arms around his wife lovingly, "what did I ever do to deserve the likes of you? I'm the luckiest man in the entire world to have you as a wife," his father had said, looking at his wife adoringly, as if there was no one in the entire universe that could measure up to her, and in that moment Edward believed he meant every word of it. Edward had shuddered, watching his parents in disgust because they were behaving all lovey-dovey. It had made him feel extremely uncomfortable, but now he longed for those days when his parents would tease each other shamelessly and giggle among themselves like a couple of loved-up teenagers. But those preciously nostalgic days from the past were now long gone. "I'm glad you know a good thing when you see it," Julia Barry had teased her husband, suddenly turning around to acknowledge little Edward, almost as if suddenly remembering he was standing in the doorway. She had given him a wink and giggled. "What do you think, Edward?" she'd asked him contentedly, rubbing her flat stomach. "Soon your mother's going to be enormous. I'm going to look like a beached whale, aren't I? What do you think about that, Edward? You're about to have a little brother or sister. What do you think?" Edward did not answer his mother. His eyes widened. He walked out of the kitchen and away from them. He could hear his mother say, "What's all that about? You'd think little Edward would be happy that he's having a little brother or sister. For years he used to ask about having a sibling. But now he's very quiet, isn't he?" Edward could hear his mother's voice sound almost disappointed and somewhat disheartened, but he didn't care about that. He needed to think about this earth-shattering news that he knew would ultimately change his life forever. "Leave him be, love," came his father's reassuring voice. "Kids, you know what they like. Sometimes they need to adjust to a bombshell like this. I'm sure he'll come around to the idea that you're having a baby, and that he's going to have a brother or sister. You must remember, there will be a sizable age gap between him and his sibling, and that's quite difficult to deal with." "Well, I hadn't thought of it quite like that," said Julia Barry. "I really wish so much I'd fallen pregnant a year after Edward was born. But we tried so much to make that happen. and it just wasn't to be. It would have been so much better if our children were closer in age. That would be an ideal situation. You are right, it's going to be an adjustment for poor little Edward. But I'm sure after a while he'll be as proud as Punch to have a sibling. Julia Barry, I don't want to see any hangdog expressions on your face, nor do I want you to be sad. We are celebrating the best news ever. We're about to be parents again. We thought you couldn't have another child, and now you're pregnant again. I, for one, could not be happier. As young Edward soulfully reflected about the significant changes he'd seen in his mother, he realized they'd all happened, even before she fell pregnant with the twins. In fact, Edward could pinpoint the day exactly when all this had happened. His mother had invited her two girlfriends, Angie and Lisa, around for tea, along with a strange, rather unorthodox woman called Zara Witchen, whom Edward instinctively disliked from the very second she'd entered their kitchen, for there was something sinister about Zara Witchen that had made Edward physically squirm. Edward's mother always invited Angie and Lisa for tea twice a week. It had become a regular routine for her, and little Edward had learnt to very politely make himself scarce by sitting on the floor in the far corner of the kitchen, so as not to disturb the adults as they talked together. He would spend this time playing with his dinky toys, cars or soldiers, and the games were so absorbing for him that he often forgot his mother and her two best girlfriends were even there, for he had grown accustomed to their presence. And to Julia Barry, both Angie and Lisa were more like sisters to her than just good friends, for the three of them were extremely close. Angie was also Edward's godmother. In the background, Edward would always hear the drone of his mother's friends' cheerful, chatty voices, along with the rattle of cutlery and the sound of tea being poured, along with the clank of teacups as they were placed back on their saucers. On this occasion, Zara Witchen had entered the kitchen, and Edward had looked up from the far corner, where he was amusing himself playing with his dinky toys. He stared up at the strange woman, his mouth dropping open. He had never seen her a day before in his life, and this woman, whoever she was, had drawn his undivided attention. He noticed that the moment Zara entered the kitchen, everything had gone extremely cold, almost as if the entire warm kitchen was now flooded with icy cold air that was extremely palpable. But none of the ladies had noticed any of this, although, to be fair, Edward's mother had suddenly expressed a keen interest to put on a cardigan. When Zara had glanced over at Edward, sitting there on the floor playing with his dinky toys, she had given him a menacious, almost devilish grin, with a perfect set of pearly white teeth that made Edward's skin visibly crawl. Edward had hurriedly looked away from the woman, as her piercing dark gaze seemed to drill right through him, and there had been a faraway look in her eyes that had scared the living bejesus out of him, and for a second, while she'd looked at him, her eyes had gone a cloudy white colour, which had given Edward the chills. Edward had tried his level best to remain anchored to the kitchen floor, as his mother expected him to behave himself and to always do his bidding, when all he wanted to do was run as fast as he could to his bedroom and hide under the mattress from this scary, intimidating woman. And to think that he would worry at night, during the lonely, long, sequestered hours, that there was a monster under his bed, when there was one in the kitchen right now, a real live monster. This was one that disguised as a woman, but there was something nefarious about her. This woman was enjoying tea with his mother and her two girlfriends, and yet they failed to see that the woman that they were entertaining was barely human. "So who do we have here?" said Zara Witchen, walking over towards Edward. He had focused his undivided attention on the dinky car he was playing with on the floor, pretending to be fully absorbed with it. He didn't want to look up at this awful woman, because as she drew closer and closer to him, the hair on Edward's back stood up on end. No one had creeped little Edward out like this woman before. Looking back as Edward did, as soberly as he could, it was definitely after the likes of Zara Witchen, when she'd entered the kitchen that day, to join his mother and her two best friends for tea, that Edward's world as he had known it had gone badly awry. In the very beginning, the changes had been so subtle, so much so that they were barely discernible. But during the course of Julia Barry's pregnancy, She became increasingly erratic, cranky, throwing things around the house belligerently, for no rhyme or reason at all. She had become unreasonably demanding, aggressively volatile, and somewhat unhinged, so much so that her uncharacteristic behaviour had often served to alarm little Edward, who had not been able to comprehend the dramatic changes he had observed in his mother's personality. Edward would have thought that now his mother was carrying twins, she would be increasingly happy these days, for her dream had been fulfilled. But it would seem the bigger Julia became, the more obnoxious and decidedly spiteful her personality. In the latter weeks of her pregnancy, Julia Barry would eat huge bowlfuls of pickles and ice cream, for her appetite for sweet and tart became almost insatiable. Wayne Barry, seeing how visibly upset and aggrieved Edward had become about his mother's capricious attitude towards him, had discreetly taken his son aside, when his mother had lashed out at him unscrupulously, and told him to get the hell away from her. Wayne Barry had put his arms affectionately around his son. "Look, Edward, I know your mother is always cranky these days, and getting easily upset about everything and nothing, but we can't take this personally. I know that I don't. You can't afford to get upset. When a woman is pregnant, there's hormones raging all around the place, well, all over the body, it would seem, causing absolute mayhem. And that is what's going on with your mother, I'm afraid, causing her to become very bad-tempered. So even if she's horrible to you, don't let it upset you. Once the babies are born, she'll be back to herself again. I can assure you of that." "But she's always horrible, Daddy," Edward had said. "She says mean things to me. She always tells me to go away. And when I tell her I'm hungry, she tells me to shut up and to leave her well alone." Wayne Barry had rubbed his hands through Edward's curly brown hair, roughing it up a little, something he did by way of affection, but Edward found it a tad annoying, for his father succeeded in messing up his hair so that it stood up on end like a hedgehog's spikes. "I know, son. It's not easy, any of this, especially not putting up with your mother's pugnacious outbursts. But you're a big boy now, are you not? We can both brave this tumultuous storm together, and there will be a light at the end of the tunnel. But you must remember, as I keep saying to you, your mother is carrying around 2 babies in that stomach of hers, so she's having a much harder time than your average pregnant woman, who only carries around 1 baby. Think about it, son. Your poor mother's having a very, very hard time. Imagine how grumpy you would feel if your feet were always swollen, if you felt nausea and morning sickness every morning, with an urgent need to throw up. Your mother needs plenty of rest. But I promise you this, son. Once the babies are born, she'll be herself again, as I keep saying." That, of course, had been wishful thinking on Wayne Barry's part, because his wife Julia really had undergone an extraordinary metamorphosis, but not the good kind, I'm afraid. Julia Barry was becoming more objectionable, increasingly irritable and aggressive, especially after the twins were born. She didn't seem like a woman who was delighted to become a mother, but on the contrary seemed to despise and resent her role, as if it was something that had been forcefully thrust upon her. Julia had always been attractive, a woman with a rosy glow that made people naturally warm to her, but these days her personality seemed somewhat disingenuous. She had always been popular with her friends, but after the twins were born, her Machiavellian, seemingly sly behaviour had turned her nearest and dearest against her, almost as if they regarded her as an enemy rather than a friend, for wherever she went, she could not resist being rude and offensive towards people. "Oh, what a lovely boy!" Zara Witchin had cooed, as she stood over little Edward that indelible day, in the kitchen, rather like a vulture over its youngling. "Such an angelic face you do have, young man," she told Edward. "I love your ash-brown hair, and your lovely eyes." She turned to look directly at Julia. "He's the picture of innocence, isn't he? I take it he's your son." "That would be right. His name is Edward," Julia had said with humour in her voice. "He may look like an angel, but don't be fooled for a second, Zara, by those adorable dimples on both of his cheeks. Believe me, my son has his moments. When angelic, he most certainly is not. I'm afraid he can be very shy with strangers. Would you say hello to Zara Witchin, love? Said Julia Barry to her son Edward. Edward politely looked up at Zara Witchin. Her eyes were framed by thick lashes, and her arched brows had been plucked very severely, within an inch of their lives, so it almost looked as if Zara had drawn an arched pencil line across them. Edward trembled as he said, "Hello," to Zara. He knew with every single fibre of his being there was something nefariously sinister and insidiously predatory about this woman, that nobody else appeared to notice. But to Edward, being able to see this was very easy, like discerning the difference between a red double-decker toy bus from a London taxicab. At 10 years old, Edward's young body was cautioning him to stay well away from Zara Witchin. She seemed profoundly evil. Why Edward felt this so instinctively, he didn't know. But he'd watched enough horror movies over the years with his mother, against his father's wishes, of course, as Wayne Barry had distinctly told his wife, in no uncertain terms, that letting a 10-year-old boy watch horror movies with her would easily disturb his sleep and give him nightmares. Julia had waved her hand nonchalantly at her husband and told him he was talking nonsense, and it was fun to be scared half to death. While this might have been true, being scared by a horror movie on television was completely different compared to being scared by a stranger who had just entered their kitchen, who came across to little Edward as being like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Edward had often heard the pastor at church talk about wolves in sheep's clothing. He had warned his congregation of such people, pretending to be godly when they were anything but. Zara Witchin's outer veneer seemed pretty ordinary, although she did have a very unflattering hook-like nose, which would have looked good on a man, but on a woman it made her look, well, rather severe. Zara had long black shiny hair that fell down to her waist. Edward had never seen such long hair before. Zara's skin was so white that even the white paint on the kitchen table seemed yellow by contrast. But it was those dark, soulless eyes that troubled Edward the most. There was something guileful and perfidiously cunning about her eyes that didn't seem altogether human. And the way they suddenly went white for a few minutes had scared the bejesus out of him. Edward had never witnessed anybody's eyes cloud over like that before, but he could see by the satisfied smirk on Zara Witchin's face that the woman had clearly wanted Edward to see her eyes cloud over, for it obviously gave her some kind of Machiavellian kick to scare him half to death. "Tell me, how old are you, little Edward?" she asked, her dagger-like eyes piercing through him, while a grin crawled across her face like a spider. Again a cold shiver ran down Edward's little spine, so much so that he was overcome with a nauseating, unpleasant feeling of impending dread that made his entire body quiver and shake, rather like that of a baby's rattle. "I'm 10 years old," he said rather gingerly, refusing to meet Zara's gaze. He didn't want to look into her eyes, for he knew if she saw how scared and intimidated he was by her, it would give her great satisfaction. "Well, it's very good to meet you," said Zara, offering him a cold, clammy hand to shake, where ugly blue veins protruded through her white skin. Edward privately shuddered in disgust. Everything about Zara Witchin was odiously foul, and even the perfume she wore smelt exactly like the fish moth balls his mother put in the closet to scare away all the moths. Edward did not want to shake Zara Witchin's hand, if he could possibly help it, but his mother was staring at him expectantly. Edward knew instinctively he had to be polite, or he'd be severely reprimanded by his mother, who couldn't abide rudeness of any kind. Edward had always been taught to be polite, so he inwardly flinched as apprehensively he took Zara Witchin's hand in his. The woman's ice-cold frosty hands felt like claws on his skin. She squeezed Edward's hand so tightly it really hurt, but Edward clenched his teeth tightly together to mask the pain he was feeling, for he didn't want Zara to know that she'd hurt him badly. He was certain that such a revelation would please her. She was clearly the kind of woman who got satisfaction from hurting things. Edward was sure of it. He inwardly sighed with relief when finally she let go of his hand, albeit a little reluctantly. Zara Witchen appeared to thankfully have suddenly lost interest in little Edward. Probably she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted from him, for he wasn't playing ball with her, and had not shown her how truly affrighted he was by her. Zara promptly joined Edward's mother and her two friends Angie and Lisa to settle around the kitchen table. Julia Barry had made a particular fuss over tea that morning, probably to impress their new guest. There were platters of tuna, egg mayonnaise, and ham and cheese sandwiches laid out rather resplendently across the table, along with plates of scones with jam and clotted cream, as well as thick slices of angel food cake that had been iced with a non-fat frosting that tasted of lemons and was decorated with sliced strawberries. Zara Witchen was warmly received by Edward's mother Julia, who had effusively welcomed her into the kitchen, treating her rather like an esteemed celebrity of note. Julia Barry seemed rather excited. Her hands trembled rather uneasily as she poured out tea from her finest bone china teapot, which she only ever used on very special select occasions, such as Thanksgiving and Christmas. So the fact that his mother had brought out the fancy tea service that morning showed that she really wanted to make a good impression on her guest. Julia Barry blushed with embarrassment. Her face grew as pink as a peony, because she was doing a clumsy job of filling up Zara Witchen's teacup, for the tea spilled and splattered into the saucer and very nearly trickled onto Zara's lap. It would seem that Julia Barry was unusually flustered that morning. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Zara," she apologized profusely. "I'm not normally such a dreadful klutz. You must forgive me. I'm just so excited to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you from my best friend Angie over here. Angie's been raving about you non-stop, especially after you read her tarot cards. She tells me everything you told her about herself and her life was absolutely true. She was so impressed by your accuracy. You told her that she'd been divorced 2 times, and there's no way you could have known that. You also said she was currently seeing another man, who she'd soon marry, and you were dead right on that. Duncan Pastel, who Angie has been dating for over 3 years now, asked Angie to marry him only the other day. You told Angie that they would get married, and now they're engaged," said Julia, letting out a laugh. "That's right, I told her she'd marry the man she was seeing, who wouldn't mess her around like the other men have done." "I know," said Julia, her face lighting up like a Christmas tree. "Angie also told me when her dog Bo went missing, you knew exactly where Bo would be found. Angie's been through 2 divorces, so Bo is particularly special to her. And when her beloved dog went missing, she was devastated and feared that Bo was dead and had been run over by a car. You told her that Bo was very much alive, and you said you could see the dog in a green field with buttercups trapped in some big hole in the ground that looked rather like an unfilled grave. Well, Angie said she knew the field you were talking about very well, and had not thought to even go and look in there. You see, Angie's backyard overlooks a field of buttercups, but she didn't know that Bo had dug a hole under her fence so that he could access the field. And the buttercup field happened to belong to her next-door neighbour, a man called Mr. Meaton. So Angie contacted him at once and told him where you had said that little Bo would be found. Mr. Meaton, would you believe it, admitted he'd actually dug a hole in the field. The hole resembled a grave, just like you described. Mr. Meaton has got a 12-year-old son, you see, who went playing around in the field one day, and he came across some ancient coins and arrowheads in a Pacific area in the field. Some, I understand, that are of significant value. Well, Mr. Meaton was understandably terribly excited about his son's discovery, so asked his 12-year-old boy to show him exactly where he'd found the coins. He took along with him a metal detector to use over the area, to see if he could retrieve more of them. It would seem his metal detector kept going off madly in one particular spot, so Mr. Meaton dug 8 foot under the ground, as if he was digging a large grave, and it was in that spot he discovered dozens more of these coins, all contained in a metal container. There was a photograph in there and a few old letters. It really was a significant find. Mr. Meaton had not got around to filling in the hole, so he rather suspected from the description of where Bo could be found, who is, of course, Angie's dog, that he was probably in the field and had accidentally fallen into the hole that he dug. And lo and behold, when Mr. Meaden took Angie to the open hole in the ground, there was little Bo, looking very sorry for herself, because she was trapped in that grave and couldn't get out. The poor little mite was not happy, but very happy to see Angie, and desperately thirsty, I believe. I hasten to say, even though Angie has not covered up the hole under her fence that goes straight into Mr. Meaden's buttercup field, the dog has not had any desire to go in there any more. I guess she certainly learnt her lesson. Well, that's very good to hear, said Zara. I was told by the spirit that I conjured exactly where little Bo would be found. The spirits never let me down, you see. Well, that's exactly why I invited you over to tea, Zara, said Julia. Angie insists that, like you helped her, she believes likewise you'll be able to help me. And let's just say, I'm badly in need of help, let me tell you. There is a big vacuous hole in my life, rather like the hole that Mr. Meaden dug in the field of buttercups, that Bo unfortunately had to fall into. There's a hole inside me very similarly, that desperately needs to be filled. It's rather like an empty void that has left me feeling rather bereft and restlessly discouraged, almost as if there's a roadblock in my life, stopping me from moving forward. I would describe myself rather like a writer that has developed writer's block, not knowing what else to write on the page, as I have no idea how to move forward, if you know what I mean. I feel stuck and uninspired, as if my life has completely lost its purpose. I'm very sorry to hear you say that, Mrs. Barry. From what you're saying, you sound as if you're rather lost, as without children, you feel as if you've lost your purpose in life, and you're very unsure of the road ahead of you, or where to go to from here. Am I right? Well, absolutely. That's an excellent way to put it, Julia Barry admitted. That is exactly how I feel. Well, I will try my best for you, Mrs. Barry, said Sarah Witchin. But I'm making no promises to you, because ultimately the decision of whether to help you or not is not mine to make. It depends on the spirits I conjure up. I will see what I can do for you, but I cannot guarantee that your wish of having another baby will be fulfilled. But on the other hand, if you are willing to give something of yourself, there is no reason you cannot get the desires of your heart. You do, of course, understand what I am saying by this, Mrs. Barry. To get something, you need to give something back, for that is how the universe works. It's called the law of reciprocity, which I'm sure you are familiar with from biblical teachings in the church. You've probably listened to over the years, I imagine. Oh, but of course, I know all about that. My mother taught me about the importance of giving when I was growing up as a girl. You have to give to receive. I think everyone knows that. When you say I need to sacrifice something, what is it that I need to give up? Julia Barry asked rather tentatively, sensing that things might not be as straightforward and uncomplicated as she had originally hoped they would be. Zara Witchin was ambiguously vague when it came to answering the question. She said, "No one knows what you will be expected to give up, Mrs. Barry, until, of course, your wish is finally granted. I, for one, cannot ascertain what spirit will ask of you. Sometimes they demand a little. Sometimes they demand much. It's rather like throwing a dice. You never know what you're going to get." "Goodness gracious me," said Julia Barry. "When you talk about wishes being granted like this, you sound exactly like a fairy godmother, like the one in Cinderella." "I wouldn't exactly describe myself that way," said Zara candidly. "I'm definitely not as sweet as the fairy godmother in Cinderella. On the contrary, I would say I'm not sweet at all." "Well, I'm going to be straight with you, Zara, as you have been with me, and lay all my cards on the table. Let's just say I would give absolutely anything to have another baby," said Julia Barry frankly. "Me and my husband Wayne, we've tried for 10 long years to have more children, but no matter what we did, Even things like leaving me suspended with my legs high up in the air half the day, in the hope that a miracle would transpire. Well, none of that worked. And believe me, we tried every inventive and creative idea we could think of. It was absolutely soul-destroying, to say the very least. Naturally, we visited a plethora of fertility clinics that promised the world but delivered nothing. None of these clinics were able to help us. I know my husband Wayne has been bitterly disappointed that we've only had one child, even though he adores little Edward as much as I do. But we both wanted so much more for our family. My husband naturally hides his feelings from me. He doesn't want me to feel bad about myself. But I have to tell you, there are times I have felt that I am not a proper woman, even though I have managed to at least have one child. If Edward hadn't arrived on the scene, I can't even imagine that. I'm not sure I'd even be here now, because I would feel utterly devastated to have been blessed with no children. Well, not blessed, actually. Let's just say I feel incomplete in my life. I so badly wanted to be a mother, to have more than one child. If the truth be told, since I was a little girl, I wanted a large family. When Wayne and I got married, we talked about nothing less. We ambitiously fancied ourselves as having dozens of kids running around and about the place. When I first met Wayne, I was a kindergarten teacher, you see. So I've always loved children. So only having one has made me feel so very unaccomplished. I hasten to say, eventually I saw a leading gynecologist, one of the best in the country, most highly esteemed in his field. His name was Nate Hooper. Now he's a very good man, who's helped couples conceive against all the odds stacked against them. Many couples who've been discarded, abandoned and spat out by other gynecologists have actually been treated by Nate Hooper, with great success, I might add. Nate Hooper has worked miracles for many young couples, but alas, not for us. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. As you can imagine, I had such high hopes and expectations when me and my husband went to see Nate Hooper, due to all the luck that barren couples appeared to be having with him. I was certain that our luck was about to change for the better, but I was so wrong about that. In truth, Nate Hooper candidly told me, in no uncertain terms, that there is nothing physically wrong with me, and no viable reason why I shouldn't fall pregnant. So the fact that I haven't been able to conceive has really perplexed him. My husband naturally got checked out as well, in case the problem rested with him. But according to Nate Hooper, my husband has a higher than average sperm count. So why I never fell pregnant is completely beyond me. It's been 10 long years since Edward was born, and every time me and my husband Wayne have thrown out the rod, hypothetically speaking, nothing has been biting at the end of our line, if you know what I mean. Nate Hooper has been stumped by all this, as have I and my husband. He had absolutely no answers for us, especially given that I fell pregnant with Edward within months of marrying Wayne. So why I suddenly appear to be barren is decidedly enigmatic, and beyond that, exceedingly frustrating. Well, I'm very sorry to hear that things have been so tough for you, said Zelda Witchen sympathetically. It can't have been easy for you, since you've always wanted to have a huge family, and you only ended up with one boy, even though I can see little Edward over there is a delightful child. But then again, many couples feel unfulfilled if they don't have more than one child. So I do understand how unsatisfied you feel. Well, growing up, it was just me and my sister, and I always used to think it would be absolutely wonderful if I had dozens of brothers and sisters running around, Julia Barry admitted. I dreamt of it all the time, actually, but my parents strictly only wanted 2 kids. So that was that. But then I always considered that one day, when I finally got married, our family would be like the Waltons, because we would have dozens of children. It was Angie Hartman who abruptly interceded in the conversation, focusing her attention on Zara Witchen. So that's why I told Julia about you, she interjected. I told her about what you've done to help me find my missing dog Bo, along with that incredible accurate tarot card reading you did for me, which was absolutely incredible. I knew if anybody could help Julia here, it would be you, Zara. So she's been so terribly excited to meet you. Over the years, I've seen how visibly upset Julia has become, not being able to have any more children. I'm very close to Julia, you see, and I'm also Edward's godmother, so I feel it's my duty to help Julia in any way I can. Julia here has been remarkably stoic and incredibly courageous about it all. She's always positive, you know, and upbeat, but I know underneath it all she's really hurting, because it hasn't been easy for her. That's why I reached out to you, Zara, in the hope you might be able to help her, because I know for Julia, not having another child has been so devastating for her. Edward's mother's two friends, Lisa Walker and Angie Hartman, were regular visitors to the Barry household. Edward tuned into the woman's conversation eagerly, as this time he was curious as to what the adults were talking about, as their focus appeared to be on Zara Witchen. Edward realized they had brought this strange woman into their house because they believed she could fix a multitude of problems for them, like the agony aunts his mother always listened to on the radio, that offered all kinds of advice to housewives, from how to keep their husbands interested in them all the time, and how to turn yourself into a domestic goddess. Edward had never heard his mother express an interest in having more children. When he was younger, he'd asked about it often enough. He had begged his mother for a brother and sister. Edward's mother had looked at him rather sorrowfully and said, "Sweetheart, it's not for me to decide whether you have a brother or sister or not. It's in God's hands." And from that, Edward had assumed it was God's will. So if he didn't have a brother and sister, he was accepting of that fact. Normally Edward wasn't remotely interested in what the adults had to say, but this time he could not help but tune in to their conversation, which was so much more interesting than usual. Normally his mother's friends garrulously gossiped about various people at church. But on this occasion, with their strange, unorthodox visitor, who had entered the kitchen and brought in with her an icy chill, it had made it close to impossible for Edward to ignore what they had to say. So he pretended to play with his collection of dinky toys. But he really felt it was like having a rattlesnake in the room, that you needed to watch very carefully in case the rattlesnake suddenly struck you down with its poisonous bite, because that's what it was like, having Zara Witchen in their kitchen. There was no doubt that this woman was scary. On the surface to look at, she seemed pretty ordinary, but her attire she wore was dramatically different to what the other ladies wore, who were wearing cotton frocks with colourful skinny belts and matching shoes. Zelda Witchen, on the other hand, was wearing a long black dress that fell to above her shoes. The dress was nipped in at the waist. It had puffy sleeves, and there were buttons going all the way down to the bottom of the dress. It was like something a governess in the 1800s would likely have worn, and was distinctly unfashionable for the time. Zelda also wore ugly black leather lace-up boots that looked strange to be wearing with a dress. She wore a necklace around her neck, with a strange pendant attached to it, that Edward didn't like the look of. He knew it was a symbol of something insidious. Edward's keen, astute, discerning eyes missed nothing. For being an only child, he'd become very observant over the years, and was much more grown up than other kids his age, and even the teachers at school said as much. Julia Barry suspected Edward's maturity was due to hanging around adults all the time, and listening to their conversations. Zara Witchen took a sip of her tea, and then placed her teacup on the saucer, her eyes now fixed steadily on Edward's mother, with an intensity that Edward thought was nothing short of disturbing. He'd loved to have known what the slippery woman was thinking. "Did Angie tell you exactly what I am?" Zara Witchen asked breezily, in a light-hearted, carefree tone of voice. Julia Barry chuckled rather uncomfortably, but she nodded. "It's hard to take it all on board. It came as a bit of a shock to me when Angie told me. I mean, if the truth be told, I never did believe witches actually existed in this day and age, especially here in North America. But Angie told me you're a practicing witch. In truth, I just couldn't believe there were any real witches around. I thought they all died out after the Salem witch trials, if indeed those women were witches at all, which I rather suspect they were not. So yes, if you really are a witch, I know one thing for certain. That is that you're not an evil one. You help people, which is why you're here." Angie emphatically believes you might be able to help me. She said that you could possibly make me up a potion that might increase my fertility and chances of falling pregnant. If you can do that for me, Zara, I will be indebted to you forever, and I'm willing to pay handsomely for any potion you might make up for me." Zara Witchen smiled. A broad grin stretched across her face, like a large elastic band. But her smile was not sweet, nor reassuring, instead decidedly unsettling. "Witches get such a bad rap," said Zara Witchen nonchalantly. "It's most unfair. Most of us want to do good in the world, but no one appreciates that. Of course, these days, many of us practicing the art of witchcraft have to hide our light under a bushel. We don't have a choice in the matter, you see. We keep what we do strictly secret. Just so you know, Mrs. Barry, contrary to what you may believe, witchcraft is alive and well here in America. But it is not something people actually know about. I never go around the place broadcasting the fact that I'm a witch. It's not a wise thing to do. Going back in history, women who worked with herbs and healing poultices were hung at the stake for being witches, when they were just herbalists trying their best to help people with alternative therapies that could be so much more successful than mainstream medicine. The Chinese have known the power of herbs for generations. When people don't understand the dynamics of something, they become incredibly fearful and call the practice of witchcraft demonic and of the devil. That's why these women were hung at the stake. They were considered a threat. Sometimes they were flung into the water to be drowned. If they drowned, they were not a witch, but it was just bad luck that they had been mistaken for one, for they had been falsely accused. If they didn't drown, then they were considered to be a witch and would end up being burnt alive at the stake. It was too dreadful for words, believe me. And even today, if you admit to people you're a practicing witch, well, you get all kinds of negative responses. So those of us who indulge in this craft, well, we have to keep it secret, don't we? When you say you're a witch, I take it you don't have a broomstick or a black cat, Angie teased, raising a brow, as all three women laughed light-heartedly, as they thought Angie's impromptu joke was rather amusing, although Edward noticed Zara Witchen did not smile. Hearing Zara Witchen profess herself to being a witch made Edward's ears tingle. Everyone knew witches were evil, so what on earth was his mother doing entertaining one of all things? Maybe his mother wanted a magic potion made for him by Zara Witchen, in the hope that she would fall pregnant. That was what this visit was all about, Edward mused. But wasn't it unwise to invite a woman who professed to be a witch into their home, who had brought in with her an icy chill into their kitchen on a warm summer day, which meant she must have powers? Had his mother underestimated Zara Witchen, he wondered. "Well, I did have a black cat once called Sooty," said Zara Witchen, "but no, I didn't bob around the place on a broomstick at night. But yes, I am a practicing witch, and witches are real. But most of us in my profession brush what we do under the carpet. Some of us just pretend to be herbalists, to hide what we do, while we help people at the same time. I'm part of a coven of witches. I happen to be the head of that coven, the leading witch, so to speak. I learnt everything I know from my grandmother, who was also a witch when she was alive, and a very good one at that, with an incredible reputation, an unblemished one. I work with potions and spells, and I have great success in my art, and I usually get excellent results with the spirits I conjure up. But I need to tell you, when I conjure up a spirit, the spirit always wants something back in return, some kind of sacrifice, so to speak. When it comes to your friend Angie, she brought a whole lot of fruit and buried it at the bottom of the garden under a tree, and that was satisfactory for the spirit, for it was hungry and craving something sweet. After that ritual, the spirit told me where Angie's dog Bo could be found, and gave me pictures in my head, and Angie was able to interpret those pictures, because she knew exactly where the field of buttercups could be located, and immediately contact Mr. Meaton to tell him about my vision. And luckily he admitted that there was a hole resembling a grave in the field that he'd recently dug up. So he took Angie to see it, and there was little Bo, So her wish was granted. "I know," said Julia. "That's why I asked my friend Angie to invite you around this morning. I'm not worried about the sacrifice. As I said, I will do absolutely anything for another child. I don't mind buying bucketfuls of fruit to bury at the bottom of my yard. As far as I'm concerned, that's a small price to pay, and a whole lot cheaper than some of those extortionately expensive fertility clinics that can rob you blind, let me tell you." "Well, I'm very glad to hear you say that, Mrs. Barry," Zelda had said, "but I feel I should offer you a cautionary note nevertheless, and that is to warn you that not every sacrifice the spirit demands is the same. It might not be fruit you're expected to buy for the spirit, but maybe the demands could be greater. Are you prepared for that?" "Absolutely," said Julia. "Shouldn't you think about what Zara has just said?" said her friend Lisa, giving Julia a warning glance. "I don't think you should rush into anything like this without thinking about it first, Julia. This is serious, you know." "No, it's not, Lisa. Don't be so overreactive. That's not necessary," said Julia. "I'm going ahead with this, Lisa. You know how much I want a baby." "Yes, I know, Julia. That's the point. You shouldn't go rushing into things blindly." "You don't know what you're talking about, Lisa. I do know what I'm doing," said Julia. "Very well," said Zara. "But before we start, Mrs. Barry, I need a drop of your blood to put in this black bottle of water," she said, pulling out a black bottle from her large leather bag that looked as if it contained everything, including the kitchen sink. Julia Barry had grabbed a needle from her sewing kit in the kitchen and pricked her finger very willingly, allowing a drop of her blood to slide into the bottle of water. She handed the bottle to Zara, who placed it on the table in a strategic position, of some importance it would seem. "Another thing, Mrs. Barry," said Zara, pulling out a pair of hairdresser scissors from her bag and passing them over to Juliet. "I'll need a lock of your hair, Mrs. Barry." Julia snipped off a lock of her hair obligingly. She handed the lock of hair and the scissors straight back to Zara, who placed the hairdresser scissors straight back into her bag, and then the lock of Julia's hair on the table next to the small black bottle that contained her blood. Julia's friend Lisa became increasingly uncomfortable, sitting around the kitchen table with her friends. It would seem she didn't know what she'd got herself embroiled in, and was not remotely happy with the way things were currently unfolding. She looked as if she would prefer it if the ground simply swallowed her whole, as right now she'd have been happy to be anywhere else in the world other than sitting around the Barry kitchen table. She kept passing Julia Barry warning glances, as if to say, "Do you know what you're getting yourself into, Julia?" But Julia Barry blindly ignored her friend. Zara Witchin pulled out some papers from her large leather bag. They looked as if they'd been torn straight out of a book, and appeared to contain some strange writing and funny-looking symbols. "I will need to do an incantation," said Zara affirmatively, "but we need to draw all the curtains in this kitchen to make sure it's dark in here, and then I will light up 6 candles that I have in my bag," she said. Zara Witchin pointed to the little black bottle that contained Julia's blood. "When the black light during the incantation lights up with a purple light, it means the spirit has answered our request, and that you will indeed be able to have a baby, Mrs. Barry. But the spirit will expect something in return, which will be revealed to you in due course, I am most sure." "But how will I know what the spirit wants me to do?" asked Julia. "The spirit will intercede in your dream, Mrs. Barry, and let you know what is required of you." "Fair enough," said Julia, nodding. "Let's get on with it, shall we? My eggs aren't getting any younger," she joked, but nobody laughed. "Sweetheart," said Julia Barry, turning to her son Edward, who looked up at her from the corner of the kitchen, where he was playing with his dinky toys on the floor. "Edward, I just think I should warn you, love. The kitchen is going to get dark for a second. Mummy is going to be lighting some candles with her guests. You stay exactly where you are on the kitchen floor, playing with your toys. You mustn't move. Zara over here is going to surround you with a circle of salt, I believe, for your protection during the ritual that we are about to perform in here. Do you understand? It's nothing to be scared about, love." Edward nodded. He was transfixed by what the women were getting up to in the kitchen, as it was brought into darkness, for his mother carefully drew all the curtains, while she removed the plates of food and teacups from the hardwood kitchen table, placing them on the sideboard. There was an air of excited anticipation in the kitchen, as all three women in the room locked eyes on Zara Witchen, although Lisa didn't look remotely happy about what they were doing, almost as if she sensed the final outcome would probably not be good. Julia Barry seemed blindsided by the fact that she might actually be playing with fire, as such was her resolute determination to have a baby. She refused to see the negative implications of such a wish, and the cost she might ultimately be forced to pay. Edward could see such hope in his mother's eyes, and an expression of faith, almost as if Julia Barry believed that this ritual was about to change her life forever. The women all sat at the table silently, watching Zara performing her ritual. Zara opened her dark leather bag and removed a velvety black pouch which contained salt, along with a piece of white chalk, all which she kept on her person. She made a circle of salt around the table, and inside the circle of salt she drew a circle with the white piece of chalk, and then with the white piece of chalk she drew an inverted pentagram on the hardwood table, and then she placed 6 candles, 1 in the centre and 5 at each strategic point of the pentagram. Zara walked over to little Edward and made a circle of salt around him as well. "While I do this, Edward, you must remain in the circle of salt at all times. You can't get out of it. Do you understand? It's for your protection." Edward did not understand, but he nodded nevertheless. Zara joined the other women at the table and told them to recite together an incantation that started with the words Secula Saculorum, which he told the women means "be my friend." They recited these words over and over again, even though they were exceedingly difficult to pronounce. Zara said they were inviting the spirit that they were calling upon to become their friend, so that the spirit would be inclined to help them. "I call upon you, spirit of Mammon. Spirit of Mammon. Spirit of Mammon, I call upon you. Spirit of Mammon, can you hear me, spirit of Mammon? I call you, spirit of Mammon, for you are my friend, you are our friend, and we invite you here today to join us around this table. Spirit of Mammon, you are our friend, we invite you here today." Edward was to learn later that Mammon was the demonic spirit of greed. "We summon you, spirit of Mammon, for your help is needed on this day. Hakula tila kikwa, haki solatina, agi kakwasa, hadlilotola, shekasada nudotola." It would seem a strange, rather incomprehensible incantation of words came out of Zelda's mouth, as all 4 women held hands together. All of a sudden a mighty wind blew through the kitchen. The curtains began to billow and shake like the sails of a boat on a tempestuous stormy sea. The entire kitchen table violently rocked and shook as if the kitchen had been hit by a mini-earthquake. All of a sudden footsteps were heard, beating against the kitchen floor, powerful, heavy, and loud. And one by one the candles went out, as if someone had walked around the table and blown them out one at a time. Zara was sitting there at the kitchen table, and suddenly her eyes rolled back in their sockets and became completely white. And then a terrifying male voice began to emerge from her throat, speaking to her in a language that Edward believed later was possibly Latin, although he couldn't be sure. "Oh, gelata, gelato, galonoto, lege, no gelata, ha, gelaguani." Zara's face suddenly contorted, and for a brief moment changed into something very demonic, but it had happened in such a quick flash like that of a camera, it would have been easy to believe that one had imagined it all. All of a sudden a purple light appeared in the middle of the dark bottle that contained a drop of Julia Barry's blood, which was standing next to her lock of hair. The lock of hair was suddenly lifted up in the air and vanished from everyone's sight, vaporizing in front of their eyes. The table began to shake violently again. The curtains billowed. A whipping wind blew through the kitchen, so even the cutlery on the sideboard and the cups and saucers began to rattle precariously. Then suddenly everything went calm and quiet, and the ritual was over. Edward was in no doubt that a demon had entered the kitchen and had blown out the candles one by one, and finally possessed Zara's body, and then promptly left the kitchen. For Zara's face had changed for a very brief moment into something that had been profoundly demonic, and Edward had witnessed that with his very own eyes. The ritual was finally finished, and Zara beamed from ear to ear. "Well, the ritual is done. Mammon came to our aid. I knew he wouldn't let us down." She handed the black bottle to Julia. "Drink that up, my dear. You saw yourself the bottle was infused with a purple light. Within a month you shall be pregnant. I am sure of that. The spirits never let me down when they honour a request of mine, and they have agreed to grant you your wish, Mrs. Barry." "As easy as that," said Julia Barry, her face lighting up. "You really think I'll be pregnant in a month's time?" "You saw the purple light going on in the bottle, did you not?" asked Zara Witchen. Julia nodded. "I certainly did see the purple light going on in the bottle. It was extraordinary. I've never seen anything like that before." "Well, the purple light means that Mammon has granted you your wish, Mrs. Barry. But remember, Mammon will be wanting something in return, and I did warn you about that." "Oh, I'm very well aware of that," said Julia Barry. "I'm willing to give up a lot to have a baby. Nothing in this life is ever free, is it?" Julia drank down the liquid quickly, claiming it didn't exactly taste of water, or even of her blood, but something that was profoundly bitter. She almost gagged from the taste because it was so vile, but the three women did their best to stop her from vomiting. For Zara told them that if she brought up the contents of the bottle, that the spell would become null and void. But even if that were to happen, the spirit of Mammon would still expect full payment. After the ritual had been performed, Zara Witchen left the Barry household, claiming that her services were required somewhere else. Julia thanked her profusely for her kindness, and Zara said she was most welcome. Once Zara Witchen left the house, the kitchen seemed to become a whole lot warmer. The women continued their tea party together, enjoying sandwiches and cakes to their heart's content, as the ritual had made them all ravenously hungry. The curtains were now fully open, so the warm sunlight filtered through the room. Things seemed normal again, but at the same time they felt remarkably different. Like when someone throws a stone in a body of water, and the water is disturbed. While the water may remain the same, the movement in the water has almost certainly changed it. "Well, what do you think, Julia, about Zara Witchen?" said Angie, her eyes lighting up. "I told you Zara was good. I knew when she found little Beau that she'd be able to help you fall pregnant. I know it hasn't happened yet, but my bet is you'll be pregnant by the month end. I don't doubt that for a single second. Zara Witchen's clearly got magical powers, has she not? Isn't she absolutely wonderful? The most fascinating person you could ever meet. And to think that she's actually a real live witch in this day and age. Who would have thought it possible?" said Angie, bubbling over with enthusiasm. "Did you hear the strange words that came out of her mouth? Did you see how the kitchen table rocked when she said her incantation? When that happened, I don't mind admitting it scared me half to death. Something was definitely in the kitchen with us, wasn't it? And for a while the spirit actually possessed Zara. Her eyes went completely white. Did you see that? I don't mind admitting it freaked me the hell out. But Zara knew exactly what she was doing, so I knew we were in great hands." "I feel very confident that she did, and that you're absolutely right, Angie. I'm so grateful you introduced the woman to me. I do feel as if I might be pregnant before the month end. I feel profoundly different after I drank that tincture that contained my blood. For some reason, I just know I'm going to have a baby very, very soon, in the next 9 months, and I can hardly wait." "Did you hear that, Lisa?" said Angie, turning around to address Julia's friend, who had remained unusually quiet. Edward could see that Lisa was wringing her hands very nervously together, in what was probably a self-soothing gesture for her. "I don't like what happened in that ritual," she said. "And yes, I did see Zara Witchen's eyes go white. Her face changed for a second. It was demonic. That's what it was, Angie. Don't be ridiculous, Lisa. Zara is a good witch. You know that. She protected us with salt, didn't she? She'd never get embroiled in something satanic. I can assure you of that. Her face did change, said Lisa insistently. I saw it change for a brief second. And that's satanic. I'm sorry, Angie, but it is. Just because Zara claims she's a good witch doesn't mean it's actually true. It's extremely naive of you, Angie, to believe everything she tells you. Everyone knows the devil is deceptive. What did Zara exactly call up? Isn't Mammon the spirit of greed? He's a demon, Angie. Why would Zara call up a demon to help Julia? Why is she messing around with demons? It's not right, said Lisa insistently. To tell you the truth, I feel sick to my stomach. I really do. I wish I wasn't involved in this ritual. I know that there was something standing there in the room with us. After Zara recited the incantation, that thing, whatever it was, it blew out the candles and possessed Zara's body for a moment. And whatever it was, its energy was profoundly evil, and I could feel it. I think it showed itself to us in her face for a second. It scared the hell out of me. Demons are real, Angie. You don't mess around with things like that, especially things from the dark side. They're notoriously double-dealing, and they never work for the greater good. My parents always taught me growing up never to mess around with stuff you don't understand. And you know something, Angie? They're absolutely right about that. There's something wrong about what we've just done. I wish I had had no part of it. I can feel it in my guts, I really can. And then what about that awful male voice? That terrifying voice that came out of Zara Witchen's own mouth. That was just absolutely horrifying. Listen to yourself, Lisa, said Angie scathingly. It's so typical of you to overreact like this and make something out of nothing. There's nothing evil about what just happened. Zara called up the spirit of Mammon to help us. A purple light went on in the black bottle, which means the spirit has chosen to help us. You should be deliriously happy for Julia, but instead, no, you've decided to whinge and moan about everything. You wanted to help Julia, didn't you? You were keen for her to get help. Now she may be just about to have a baby that she's always wanted and yearned for. You're not even happy for Julia. What kind of a fair-weather friend does that make you? Lisa glared at Angie contemptuously. I should be deliriously happy, should I, Angie? We just called up a demonic spirit to ask for help, guided by a woman who claims to be a witch. You go on and on about Zara Witchen being so great because she helped you recover your lost dog Bo, and things seemed so benign. But I'll tell you something for nothing. That woman gave me the chills. She made my skin visibly crawl. The kitchen became icy cold when she came here today. And it's warmed up now that she's gone away. Something's not right about her. I think she's demonically possessed, I really do. Oh, for goodness sake, Lisa, listen to yourself. Where are all these insane ideas of yours coming from? These ideas are not ideas. They're called gut instincts, if you must know. We're given these instincts by God to guide us to make better choices in our lives. Let me tell you something for nothing, Angie. The moment I saw Zara Witchen, every hair on my head stood up on end, and that's not normal, nor is it natural. That's never ever happened to me before. You might only have had to give the spirit's fruit, which you buried in your yard under the apple tree, when Zara Witchen revealed to you where little Bo could be found. But that's what demons do, don't they? You only have to pay a little in the beginning, but later on you have to pay a lot. What if she expects Julia here to give up something very, very big? Like what? Asked Angie. Like her soul or something? Oh, for goodness sake, Lisa, you're being ridiculous. Zara is a good witch. She's helping us. You heard her saying she helps people like she helped me find Bo, and gave me a very accurate tarot card reading, which was exceedingly helpful. She said that witches had had a bad rap for centuries, so she has to do what she does undercover. She was here to help us. She didn't have a duplicitous agenda, I assure you. She kept us safe with that circle of salt around the table. There is nothing sinister about Zara Witchen. I would be the first to know if there was. She is a very professional witch. She knows exactly what she's doing, and she's a good person. I'm very sorry, Angie, but I'm going to have to disagree with you on this one. I didn't like Zara Witchen from the word go. I know it's not what you want to hear, but it's what I feel. Didn't you notice how dark her eyes were? In my opinion, they were insidiously evil. I watched her walking over to little Edward over there, and the poor little mite trembled. Kids are very sensitive to spirit, you know, much more so than we adults are. I remember hearing about that somewhere. I could tell at once that Edward didn't like her at all. Let's just say, Angie, I think engaging in this ritual was possibly the most stupidest, most ignorant thing we've ever done together as friends. Did you not feel the icy cold wind enter the kitchen, and see how everything rocked and shook, how the curtains billowed, how the candles went out? There were no windows open. There was no draught. I don't believe there is such a thing as a good witch. I really don't. They're all the same. The woman is calling up demons, for goodness sake. So even if she considers herself to be helping people, we all know that demons by nature have nefarious agendas. All I can say is I hope we haven't invited something evil into our lives, like people sometimes do when they play with a Ouija board. I'm definitely going to see my pastor, as soon as I possibly can, and have him pray over me. I feel as if I've been contaminated by something filthy, dirty, and insidiously evil, almost like when you've been to a hospital and visited a sick person, and you safeguard yourself by taking supplements so you don't end up with the infection that they've got. A silence descended over the kitchen table. Neither of the women spoke. Lisa's words seemed to have caused a feeling of uncertainty to rise up among the women, so much so that the atmosphere was drained of its joyful chatter. And the women soon excused themselves and were gone from the Barry household. And after that, things were never the same ever again. Even when Edward's father Wayne returned home that evening, after the ritual had been performed earlier on in the morning, he asked his wife Julia if something was different about the house. Julia had said, "No, what do you mean different? Of course nothing is different, darling. Everything's exactly the same." Wayne thought about it for a brief moment and said, "Well, if you haven't moved around any furniture, love, then something else is different in this house. But I can't for the life of me think what it is. But whatever it is, I can't say that I like it." Little Edward knew the difference his father was talking about. It was the atmosphere in the house after the ritual had been performed, as it was never the same again. It was almost as if the darkness, a very slow, clawing darkness, had descended over the Barry household. But it was so subtle in those early days that it was barely discernible. But it was rather extraordinary that Wayne Barry had picked up on it at once, for he had no idea what had transpired in the house earlier on in the morning, and their strange visitor that was about to turn their lives upside down and inside out. After Zara Witchen's visit, things in the Barry household were worse than they'd ever been, for whatever his mother had drunk in that black bottle had certainly succeeded in making her pregnant. But the mother Edward had known and loved was not the same woman that would tuck him into bed every evening, tell him how much she adored him, and read him a bedtime story. Indeed, there was something significantly darker about Edward's mother these days. When the twins had arrived on the scene, all hell had broken loose in the Barry household, and since then there had been no peace. Beyond the screams of the twins, the arguments between Edward's father and mother that had flared up continuously and got extremely out of hand, as not a good or kind word seemed to be expressed between the two of them, and for some reason they were always at each other's throats, like two rabid dogs. Julia Barry was tirelessly complaining about her sad lot in life. Although she had claimed she had wanted children, Edward had seen how she had sometimes looked at the twins with so much resentment and hatred, almost as if she wanted to throw them against the wall like a couple of eggs, and secretly hoped that they would break. The lovingly adoring, attentive mother that had nurtured Edward for the last 10 years had become like a distant dream to him, for she had changed exponentially in more ways than you could ever imagine. Edward really did not recognize the person his mother had become, for not only did she not seem to care for the twins, as she should have done so, but she had so little regard for Edward at all, and was guilty of neglecting him most of the time. So when he returned home from school, He felt both abandoned and estranged from his mother, and would spend most of his time busying himself in his bedroom, playing away with his dinky toys, to while away the long lonely hours. Edward began to feel very much alone in the world, a lost little boy who had nowhere to turn for support or help. He was lucky that their next-door neighbour, Mrs. Alice Weinstein, who lived on her own in the house next door, worked at the local school that Edward attended, as a secretary to the headmistress. She had agreed to always take Edward to and from school. Edward was glad he didn't have to rely on his mother to collect him from the school gates every day, for he was absolutely certain his mother would forget to even bother to pick him up. These days she seemed to be preoccupied and profoundly distracted, caught up in her own little world. On this day, like so many days before, Edward had been furiously hungry, absolutely famished. The demand for food in his entire body had made him feel light-headed and exceedingly weak. His stomach was lurching, growling and twisting itself into knots. He hadn't eaten anything since he'd got back from school. He reluctantly opened the door of his bedroom and entered the nursery where his mother was attending to the twins, who were screaming so loudly that their cries echoed all over the house. Every time Edward's mother touched the twins and handed them a bottle to feed them, they always screamed, almost as if they couldn't stand being comforted by their own mother. "Mummy," Edward whispered. His voice was urgent and politely quiet. "I'm very hungry, Mummy. I only had an apple. I've only eaten an apple all day, and yesterday I only had half an apple and half a piece of bread, and that's all, and I'm really, really hungry, Mummy." Edward's mother, Julia, glanced up at him. Her eyes were as black as the night. She hissed at him contemptuously. "Can't you see I'm busy with the twins, Edward?" she had snapped. "If you're hungry, make yourself something to eat, for God's sake. You're not a baby, are you? You've got 2 hands, have you not?" "Yes, Mummy, but there's nothing in the house to eat. Everything's in the freezer. There's no fresh food anywhere." Edward didn't know how to use the cooker, and although there were indeed fish fingers and chips in the freezer, Edward would not have the first clue on how to prepare them for himself, for he certainly could not cook at his young age. He did for a moment consider eating them frozen, for that was how insatiable his appetite was. The cereal and bread were all finished, and had not been replaced, as his mother was always forgetting to go shopping. He couldn't help himself to anything, and Edward had not eaten all day, as his mother's attention was devoted to her 2 6-month-year-old twins, and these days she barely even noticed Edward at all, for it would seem the twins demanded her attention undividedly, and Edward was beginning to feel as if he may as well not even exist, for his mother barely gave him a second glance, and when she did, she'd launch an attack on him, with her condescending, vicious words. "Well, if there's nothing in the cupboard, then there's something in the freezer. Cook it yourself, for goodness sake." Edward, after looking around the kitchen and realised there was nothing to eat, returned to his bedroom to gain comfort from watching the rain beating down on the roof. He was so desperately hungry that even though he had schoolwork to complete, he could not concentrate without eating something. For a brief moment, Edward did consider eating perhaps newspaper or toilet paper to suppress his appetite and fill the vacuous hole inside his stomach. But he thought better about it. He decided that his body would probably not be fooled by these empty calories, and eating such things might only exacerbate his hunger all the more. The rain had subsided, and Edward had a great idea. People's bins had been placed outside their houses for the morning bin collection. He wondered if Mrs. Weinstein from next door had thrown out any leftovers into her dumpster that he could possibly eat. I mean, she lived on her own, did she not? She was a slim woman who didn't eat that much, so it was more than likely that she had leftovers that she'd thrown out in her dustbin. As Edward reflected over this, he became hungrier and hungrier. He glided swiftly down the staircase, paused for a moment to check that his mother was in the nursery. She was screaming at the twins. "For God's sake, why on earth don't you two shut up? I've fed you, isn't that enough? What more do you bloody want?" she cursed furiously. Edward clandestinely slipped out of his house. He crossed the front yard. The grass was wet under his feet, and the leafy green foliage in the yard shimmered with a glossy vibrancy after the recent deluge. It was late afternoon, and not many people were round and about, although he did see Mr. Drewman from number 38 bringing out his dustbin so that the garbage collectors could pick up his rubbish the following morning. He looked up at Edward and waved at him. Edward responded in kind, lifting up his small little hand and giving Mr. Drewman a courteous bob of the head, and watching the man retreat back to his house, closing the door behind him. Edward then glanced up and down the street to make sure that nobody else was round and about who might possibly notice him. He knew what he was about to do would absolutely disgust his mother, if she were ever to find out about it. But when you're raging hungry like Edward was, you'll stop at nothing to get your hands on some satisfying food. Edward hurried over to Alice Weinstein's bin, pushing it to one side so it crashed on the pavement, spilling out some of its contents. By now Edward's stomach was growling with hunger, and he was filled with an animalistic determination to scavenge for food. Edward hurried over to Alice Weinstein's dustbin, pushing it to one side rather clumsily, so it crashed on the pavement, spilling out some of its contents. By now Edward's stomach was growling with ravenous hunger, and he was filled with an animalistic determination to scavenge for food. He worked his way gingerly through Mrs. Weinstein's bin, lifting through the contents as carefully as he could, making sure he didn't miss something that would be good to eat. But to his disappointment, he was greeted to potato peelings and empty wrappers from packets of flour and icing sugar, along with a finished packet of cereal. But then Edward found a bag with a picture of a kitty cat on the front, and Edward liked the picture because he'd always liked cats. The label on the bag said Tuna Fish Delight, and Edward loved tuna, so he decided to taste the pellets in the bag. They were delicious, he thought, so he grabbed handfuls of these fishy treats in his hands, gobbling them up furiously, feeling a sense of relief wash over him, for it was so good to be eating for a change. "Edward Barry, is that you?" came Mrs. Weinstein's voice. Edward's face flushed bright pink with embarrassment, for he didn't expect to be caught red-handed, pilfering through Mrs. Weinstein's bin. Some of the pellets he was eating popped out of his mouth and dribbled down his chin. He looked at Mrs. Weinstein sheepishly, with an expression of guilt written all over his face, as he stood among the rubbish, wishing with all his heart that the ground would swallow him whole. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Weinstein. I am really sorry. I didn't mean to," he said. "Edward, you're eating cat food. Do you realize that? I threw that bag out earlier this morning. My cat Roly-Poly refuses to eat it. She's such a fussy old thing, she is. I think it's because it's reduced calorie. The vet advised me to put Roly-Poly on a diet, but she won't touch those biscuits that you are eating. Are you hungry, Edward?" Edward nodded. Tears spilled down Edward's cheeks, which he tried to wipe away. He didn't want Mrs. Weinstein to see that he was crying, but she hadn't missed a trick. Mrs. Weinstein looked indignant, but not with Edward, it would seem. She briefly glanced up at Edward's house, glaring at it furiously. For if she'd had her way, she'd have marched up to the front door and given Julia Barry a piece of her mind. "Tell me, Edward dear, when did you last get to eat?" asked Mrs. Weinstein, her face dappled with grave concern. "I've happened to notice that rather recently you've been looking incredibly thin. Your clothes are practically falling off you." "I'm always hungry, Mrs. Weinstein," Edward admitted. "But why is your mother not feeding you, love?" "She's very busy with the twins. She hasn't got time," said Edward candidly. "That's no excuse. Absolute nonsense," said Mrs. Weinstein, unable to hide the disgust in her voice. Her purple head of hair seemed to be shaking furiously. She grabbed Edward by the hand. "You're coming with me, love. I'm going to cook you a slap-up meal right now. Do you like ice cream, Edward?" Edward nodded. He loved ice cream. "I love ice cream." "Good," said Mrs. Weinstein. "I want you to make me promise something, Edward. Do you think you can do that for me?" Edward nodded. "If you ever feel hungry again, I want you to knock at my door. I'll make you something to eat. You're not going to find anything nice in my dustbin. I can assure you of that. Do you understand?" Edward nodded, as Mrs. Weinstein led him into her house. Mrs. Weinstein gave Edward a huge bowl of ice cream to eat, which he wolfed down so quickly and then she cooked him a meal of bacon, eggs, sausages and French fries, along with some baked beans and thick slices of toast, which she buttered very thickly. Edward ate and ate until he could eat no more, and there wasn't a single crumb that was left on his plate. Finally, Mrs. Weinstein told Edward to wait in the kitchen for her. She'd only be a moment, but Edward could hear she was on the telephone to someone. He stood at the kitchen door listening in to the conversation, realizing in abject horror that Mrs. Weinstein was actually talking to his own father. "Hello, Mr. Barry. Yes, it's Alice Weinstein speaking. I've got your son Edward with me right now. He's currently in my kitchen. I'll send him home in a moment. I'm extremely worried about his welfare, Mr. Barry. I don't know how to break this to you tactfully. I caught your son eating my cat's pellets from my dumpster. I'd thrown them out because they're low-calorie and my cat Roly-Poly refuses to eat them. Your son was digging in my dumpster 45 minutes ago. He was half-starved, Mr. Barry. He says he can't remember the last time he had a good meal, or his mother cooked him any food. He says she claims to be very busy these days with the twins, too preoccupied to prepare him a meal. She told him to make his own food, but he can't cook, and the cereal and bread at home were all finished. I made him some food myself a moment ago. Oh, he ate everything. I can't believe how starved he was. I've never seen anything like it before, Mr. Barry. Normally I would report this to social services, because a starved child is an abused child as far as I'm concerned. But I know you are very good people, Mr. Barry. Well, you and your wife. I've known you both for years, so I'm sure this is an oversight on your wife's part. I mean her forgetting to feed your son. But I can't allow this to ever happen again. He's a growing boy, Mr. Barry, who desperately needs those calories to grow big and strong. He gobbled down that food like I've never seen anyone eat before. I hope you don't take offense to me letting you know about this, but I'm extremely worried about your boy. I understand what it's like for Mrs. Barry. You know, looking after twins. It must be a huge responsibility for her. But she also needs to pay attention to her boy. I'm sure you agree with that. Yes, that's right, Mr. Barry. Well, yes, I did notice your son seemed to be looking rather thin these days. His clothes have been hanging off him for quite a while. I noticed it, and so did many of the teachers at the local school. I was quite worried about him. I also observed when I lifted him up from school the other day that he was uncannily pale and seemed to have somewhat lost his spark. The teachers were only saying the other day at school how Edward is not concentrating in classes these days, which is very unusual for him because he's a very bright boy. Now I realize that he hasn't been eating, well, I've been able to connect the dots. I can't say I'm remotely surprised. How can you possibly concentrate in class or on your lessons when you're undernourished, as your body is so demanding of food, especially at that young age? I'm exceedingly worried about him, Mr. Barry. I do realize that your wife Julia has her hands full all the time with those twins of hers. And I know it's not easy, but it's negligent of her to ignore little Edward. Yes, I agree with you, Mr. Barry. Absolutely. Finally, the phone call ended rather abruptly, and Mrs. Weinstein entered the kitchen with a warm smile on her face. I've just spoken to your father on the phone, Edward, she told him. Am I in big trouble, Mrs. Weinstein? Edward asked, his eyes growing round. Absolutely not, love. Of course you're not in any trouble. Where on earth did you get that absurd idea from? Your father was horrified to learn that you haven't been eating properly. He says your mother never goes shopping for food these days, and he's very aware of that. But he had no idea things had got so bad. He's going to make sure that things change around your house straight away. He says he's going to do a big food shop before he returns home tonight. He's very concerned that your mother's not giving you enough attention, Edward, because the twins demand so much of her time. Your mother appears to have overlooked your needs. As a result, your father feels very bad about what has happened. But as I was saying, if you are ever hungry again, Edward, just come to me straight away. You are welcome at my house any time. And always remember I keep lots of food in my pantry. You understand what I'm saying, Edward. There is no need for you to ever go hungry, especially when I live right next door to you." Edward nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Weinstein, and thank you for the ice cream. It was delicious." Mrs. Weinstein gave Edward a warm hug and told him to go home. She gave him a box of cookies and a litre of strawberry ice cream to put in the freezer that he could eat later when he got hungry. When Edward slipped into his house, his mother was lying fast asleep on the couch, snoring quietly. These days, when his mother wasn't screaming, she was sleeping, for she seemed to be incessantly tired all the time. Edward quietly returned to his bedroom. He felt so satisfied after eating so much at Mrs. Weinstein's. He lay back contentedly on his bed and fell into a deep sleep. It was so good for a change to go to bed without feeling those wretched, debilitating hunger pangs. When Edward woke up a while later, the house appeared to be cast in darkness, so he assumed it was quite late. He must have slept like a baby, for nothing had disturbed his sleep, not until now, that is. Edward heard loud voices in the house that disturbed the serenity of what had been for him a delicious, serene sleep. He sat up abruptly in bed, his ears standing up on end, as he listened to the loud voices, which he knew of course meant that his parents were having an argument again. Edward climbed out of bed. He was still wearing the clothes he'd changed into after returning home from school earlier that day, but he was not wearing his pyjamas at this stage. Edward clandestinely opened his bedroom door, eavesdropping on his parents' argument. It seemed more heated than usual. Indeed, he'd never heard his father sound so incredibly outraged. "What the hell is wrong with you, Julia? Do you have any clue how humiliating it was for me to receive a phone call from Alice Weinstein?" She was concerned about Edward. She found him at her dumpster eating out of a bag of cat food she'd thrown out that even her cat didn't want to eat. Can you imagine how hungry Edward must have been to be seen digging around in someone's dumpster looking for scraps? It's pitiful, and it's a poor reflection on you as a mother. It's shameful, Julia, it really is, that you've ignored our son's intrinsic needs. And I'm grateful it was Mrs. Weinstein who saw little Edward scrambling away in the bin, and not someone else. God knows what other people would think if they saw such a thing. If they actually knew that there was a boy on our street that was starving hungry. Mrs. Weinstein brought him into her house, cooked him up a big meal. She said he bolted it down like a half-starved animal. Why the hell haven't you been feeding our son, Julia? You never ever go shopping these days. I've got a ton of shopping in the boot as a result. Plenty of food to last us a long time. According to Mrs. Weinstein, you expected little Edward to cook his own meal. Are you insane? He's never cooked a day in his life. What's wrong with you, woman? How dare that nosy old cow put her big fat nose in our business where it doesn't belong? Of course I'm feeding Edward. That old bat is talking absolute nonsense. Lying through her teeth, she is. She's not talking nonsense, Julia, nor is she lying. Mrs. Weinstein wouldn't make up stories like this. You don't want to face the truth, do you, Julia, about your so obvious neglect? The truth is you haven't been feeding our son. You've become a deplorable mother. What on earth is wrong with you? You're not the woman I married, the woman who loved children so much and would do absolutely anything for them. Now you positively seem to resent little Edward, and the twins as well, as if they become thorns in your side. These days I feel as if I don't even know who you are. Don't listen to that stupid woman, Julia Barry cried out indignantly. She doesn't know anything about what she's talking about. She's trying to make me look like a bad mother. She knows a great deal. She says these days Edward looks very thin and pale. He's undernourished. I gather the teachers at school have been talking about Edward for quite some time. They said he used to be so bright, but they noticed he's not paying attention in class. His grades are slipping. And you know why? Because he's so damn hungry. Why the hell don't you go shopping, Julia? These days you've become bone idle. There's no excuse for your apathy. None at all. I'm very busy all the time with the twins, Wayne. You have no idea how hard I work around the house, attending to their every need. They're very demanding, you know. You claim to work so hard, but why is it every time I come home you're lying fast asleep on the couch? These days, when I return home, the house looks like a bomb has hit it. There's mess everywhere. The washing never gets done, and I don't think this house has seen a hoover for a long time. When I come home, the twins are screaming. I can't put up with this nonsense a moment longer, Julia. I'm going to take little Edward to stay with my father in Canada for a while, and then when I return home, we're going to sort this mess out once and for all." At that, Edward quickly closed the bedroom door behind him, blocking his ears. He didn't want to hear his parents arguing any more. It really did disturb the peace in the house. So he quickly returned to bed, and once again drifted off into a deep sleep. Later that evening, Edward remembers his father coming into his bedroom, and sitting on the end of his bed. He cleared his throat uncomfortably for a moment and said, "Sorry, son. I didn't mean to wake you up like this, but I just wanted to have a wee little chat with you." Edward then sat up in bed. He wiped away the sleepy debris from his eyes and let out a big yawn. "What is it, Daddy? Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, son," said Wayne Barry, looking a tad uncomfortable as he spoke. "I got a phone call from Mrs. Weinstein this afternoon. When I was at work, she told me that you were eating cat pellets out of the bin because your mother hasn't been feeding you properly. As you can imagine, Edward, when I heard this, I was extremely shocked." "I'm so sorry, Daddy. I didn't mean to eat cat biscuits out of the bin. I was just hungry. I didn't mean to do it." "No, son. Don't you dare apologize for any of this. None of this is your fault. If anyone's to blame, it's me. I'm angry with myself for not noticing what is going on under my very nose. I should have realized how thin you were getting. I'm very grateful to Mrs. Weinstein for pointing this obvious fact to me." "So you're not going to be punishing me, Daddy? You're not angry?" "Punish you? Goodness gracious, no. And of course I'm not angry with you. You were hungry, looking for food. It's the most natural thing in the world to do when someone is hungry. I feel very ashamed that there was nothing for you to help yourself to in the kitchen. Your mother doesn't shop these days. She always seems to be so distracted. I'm not sure what's going on with her, but I want to find out, get to the bottom of it, so to speak. That's why I'm going to take you on this road trip. We're going to Canada to stay with your grandfather. Do you remember your grandfather? He came to stay with us for a week when you were 5 years old. When he stayed with us, the two of you got on very well. Do you remember that?" "I can't remember him very well, Daddy. I was only 5. I'm 10 now. A great deal older, you know." "Well, of course you are. Silly me. How can I expect you to remember him? That was a long time ago, was it not? Well, anyway, I phoned him up. He says he would be delighted for you to stay with him for the next 3 weeks or so. You're going to have the time of your life with him, son, let me tell you. It'll be a great opportunity for you to get to know your grandfather better. He's a very good man. You'll miss a bit of school, of course, but I phoned Mrs. Weinstein about 10 minutes ago. She says she'll talk to the headmistress for us on our behalf and inform her that you're taking the next 3 weeks off. Mrs. Weinstein thinks the fresh air in Canada will do you the world of good, and I agree with her on this one. I need you to get strong again, to get your health back, son." "But I'm not sick, Daddy. I was just hungry, that's all." "I know, son. You'll be living with your grandfather in his cabin in the country. I know my father knows how to make a mean beef stew and dumplings, so hopefully he can help put some meat on those bones of yours. He's an excellent cook, you know. I'm sure my father would very much appreciate your company. He was very sad, you know, when your grandmother died before you were born. If she were alive today, she would have doted on you. Your grandfather was very sad when she passed away, so much so that he moved away from Michigan to Canada and bought himself a cabin in the countryside. Thankfully, he's managed to find himself again." "But what exactly does that mean, Daddy?" asked Edward. Wayne Barry reflected on his own words. "Well, when I was saying your grandfather has found himself again, I don't mean he was lost. Well, actually, I suppose he was. As I was saying, he was very sad when your grandmother died. He loved her very much, you see, but he managed to find happiness again in his life, even without her around. So he's made some remarkable strides, I'm glad to say." "But why did Granny die?" asked Edward. "Well, she had a brain aneurysm in her sleep. When your grandfather woke up that day, well, that night, I think it was early in the morning, actually, he found she was dead. He was very sad about that. He refused to eat anything for a long time. I really thought he'd die as well. Because when people lose someone they love, Edward, sometimes they lose their own will to live. Then they don't look after themselves, so they fall into bad health, and one thing leads to another, and then they die. But that did not happen to your grandfather. One day he told me he'd bought a cabin in Canada. I was rather surprised by this sudden announcement of his, because I thought he wouldn't belong living in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. But he moved there, made friends, and lo and behold, he's become happy again. I think he actually enjoys his sequestered life in the Canadian countryside. And when he wants to be social, he goes to the local town and meets up with people. I don't doubt for a single second he doesn't stop thinking of your grandmother every day. But at least he's managed to find some peace. And when you go and stay with him, I think he's going to be incredibly happy." "So I'm staying with him for 3 whole weeks? That's a long time, Daddy, is it not?" "It's not long, son. It's very short. It'll go by very quickly, especially when you're having a good time. I just need your mother to concentrate on getting better before you come back home. I want her to see a good doctor, because something's not right with her." "Will the doctor get rid of that thing that lives inside her?" asked Edward candidly. "What are you talking about, son? Nothing lives inside your mother." "But it does. It came to live inside her after the witch cast her magic spell." Wayne Barry looked confused and didn't know what to make of Edward's words, but he encouraged his son to pack. Later that night, Edward found himself seated on the passenger side seat of his father's car. He was still wearing his pajamas. His father drove all the way to Canada, from their home in Michigan. The journey to the Blue Mountains, where Edward's grandfather lived, was about 8 hours away. They left Michigan at midnight, after Julia Barry had protested with great indignance about Wayne taking her son to stay with his father. "But you can't just take him off to Canada like that," she said furiously. "Edward belongs here with me and the twins." "I'm taking him to my father's in the Blue Mountains until you get your act together, Julia. You need to see a doctor, love. You're not yourself these days. Maybe you're suffering from postnatal depression or anxiety, who knows? The doctor will know exactly what to prescribe for you." "I am most sure about that. I don't know why I didn't see this before. You've been so angry and reactive these days. But now I completely understand. You're not coping, love, with the demands of raising our children. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Plenty of women in your position find raising kids to be very challenging. And I do know the twins are demanding. We need help in this house of ours, because you're not managing. Mrs. Weinstein believes you are suffering from postnatal depression, because it would explain your behavior of late." Julia Barry's nostrils flared. She gritted her teeth together furiously, glaring at her husband with an expression of such hatred that Edward couldn't even bear to look at her face. What on earth was wrong with his mother? He asked himself, knowing, of course, full well what was going on with her. There was a demon living inside her. He'd seen its face often enough. "How dare you say I'm not managing?" Julia had screamed, the outrage very discernible in her voice. Julia Barry began to indiscriminately throw things around the house, so there were breakages from china and pottery that were now lying in dead carcasses across the living-room floor. But Wayne Barry paid them no heed. Little Edward had seen for a brief moment his mother's face morph into that demonic entity again. When Wayne Barry was out of hearing distance, Edward's mother's voice changed, becoming deep and gravelly. She looked straight at Edward, with devilishly menacious eyes that were not her own, but were as black as licorice. "What are you staring at, little Edward? Happy you're going away from here, are you? I can get you wherever you go." At that his mother burst into cackling laughter that had scared the bejesus out of little Edward, who had never heard his mother's voice change like that before. It was exactly the same voice that he had heard coming out of Zara Witchen months before. Edward knew that it was not his mother who had addressed him, but the demon that had possessed her and was living inside of her. Edward was secretly rather glad to be getting away from his mother, as that thing that had taken over her body was getting progressively stronger and stronger by the day, and slowly and surely taking over everything. Only rarely these days did he get glimpses of the mother he once knew and loved, but she was in there somewhere, but being smothered by this demonic entity. Edward was sure his father had absolutely no clue as to what was really going on with his wife Julia. Over the last few months he had physically distanced himself from his wife. Wayne Barry could hardly bear to look at her. There was something about his wife that had put him on edge. In the old days he had loved the bones of her, but since she had fallen pregnant with the twins, and even after they were born, his wife had changed beyond recognition. If it wasn't for his children, Wayne Barry would have filed for divorce without even blinking an eyelash, for he was not happy in his relationship any more, and he hadn't understood why Julia's own family seemed to refuse to want to speak to her these days, along with her two best friends, for she had turned everyone against her, including even her own dentist. Now his son Edward was the latest victim of her incompetent negligence. Wayne Barry ignored his wife's shenanigans as she continued to throw things around the house. He helped little Edward pack a suitcase, and before Edward had known it, he was being swept away by his father in his dad's car to visit a grandfather he had never met. Well, had met, but had no memory of. Wayne Barry was expecting to arrive at his father's cabin at some time after 8 or so, depending of course on how good the roads were and how many stops they had to make along the way. Edward slept most of the trip, and when he finally opened his eyes, he was staring out at the most glorious views and shimmering golden sunrise that had spread magnanimously across the somewhat demure powder blue sky in a cheerful golden glow. Edward wound down the window eagerly and gasped at the beauty that surrounded him, as craggy rocks and glorious mountains slashed their sculptural resplendence proudly across the horizon, and were so incredibly majestic they literally took Edward's breath away. "Grandpa Otter lives around here?" he asked wondrously. "It's so pretty." "You like it, son?" "Yes, it's lovely." "Well, he does live here. This is the Blue Mountains," his father told him. "We are now in Canada. This is a famous ski destination, would you believe? In this part of the world there are lots of stunning waterfalls, rainforests, limestone caves. And you see those craggy rocks over there in the distance? Well, they're known as the Three Sisters. You're really going to enjoy staying with your grandfather," Wayne Barry assured his son. Before long, Edward's father's silver Alfa Romeo rattled down the long dirt road, surrounded by thick brush and lovely, luxurious wood groves of tall, lofty trees. Soon the car drew up to a small wooden cabin that looked like an old miner's cabin. The door of the cabin suddenly swung abruptly open. Edward's grandfather, Otter Barry, was standing outside the cabin door on his wraparound porch. He was looking straight at them, dressed rather casually, wearing a bucket hat on his head, along with a brightly coloured shirt covered in salmon pink and orange flamingos, as well as a pair of blue denim shorts that were faded, and a pair of boots on his feet. Edward was not sure how old his grandfather was, because the broad smile across his face, along with his perfect set of pearly white teeth, which were obviously his own, made him look significantly younger than his real years. But the telltale lines on his face, the crow's feet around his hazel green eyes, and the deep olive colour of his complexion, that was heavily bronzed from spending a copious amount of time out of doors, suggested he was older than he first appeared. Otter Barry had a day-old shadow across his chin, which gave him a somewhat rugged appearance, probably because he hadn't shaved for a day or so. Before Edward Barry could blink his eyes, his grandfather had quickly hurried over to the Alfa Romeo, in a spirit of delighted enthusiasm, for he was eager to see his son and his grandson. Seconds later they were embracing, and Edward was certain he could see misty condensation gathering in Otter Barry's eyes, which suggested he was holding back tears, and was so pleased to see the both of them. It's very good to see you, son. Very good indeed. It's been far too long, and I've really missed you. Why, I think it's been 5 years, has it not? It's sure been a long time, Dad. And we really haven't got an excuse, have we? I mean, we only live 8 hours away from you. We should have got together far sooner. Never mind, son. You're here now, and that's what counts. Ah, so this must be little Edward, said Otter, embracing his grandson with a warm hug. Goodness gracious me, you have grown up, young man. You've grown into quite a big boy now. Come in, the both of you. You must both be so very thirsty after your long trip. And we have a lot of catching up to do, have we not? I want to hear all your news. It was over beers and a few snacks that Edward's father and Grandpa Otter were caught up together in deep conversation. Edward realized that his father was telling Grandpa Otter all about his mother Julia and her strange unorthodox behaviours that were causing him grave concern. Oh, dear me, son. I'm very sorry to hear all that. You say Julia's completely changed after the twins were born. Could she possibly be suffering from postnatal depression, I wonder? I understand it's very common in women after they've given birth. I dare say your poor wife has had her hands full raising the twins. It couldn't have been easy for her. I'm not sure it is postnatal depression, Dad. Julia started exhibiting these bizarre behaviours even before the twins were born. I feel as if I've been married to a stranger all this time. I'm doing my best to ignore her as often as I can, because I don't enjoy being in her company any more. I can't continue to live like this. It's insufferable. I feel very uncomfortable in my wife's presence. We're always at each other's throats these days. I feel as if I don't know her any more. But you loved her once, son, and she was very good for you. I don't know, Dad. Something's seriously wrong with her. Sometimes I look at her and I cannot recognize the woman I married. This version of my wife I do not like. There are moments I'm afraid to return home. As I keep saying, we fight like cat and dog all the time. There are days when her eyes grow so insidiously dark that they scare me half to death. Almost as if it's not my wife who's in my presence, but someone else, as strange as that may sound. Good Lord, son, that does sound ominous. I never imagined you'd ever talk about the love of your life in such a dismissive way like this. Things must be very bad for you. When I got your phone call last night, I was flabbergasted. You sounded so... What's the word? Said Otter Barry, rubbing the rough shadow on his chin. I think disquieted is probably an apt word to use. That's exactly why I'm here, Dad. Julia has been ignoring Edward's most intrinsic needs. A neighbour, would you believe it, found him eating cat pellets out of the bin. That's how hungry he was. She took him into her house to give him a slap-up meal. She'd noticed for quite some time that Edward was looking unusually thin. You see, she's a secretary for the headmistress at the school that Edward attends. She lifts him to school all the time, so she's noticed him becoming thin. She was furious that Julia had been failing to feed our son. She actually threatened to go to social services and report my wife for child neglect. I begged her not to do it, but she said if Edward lost any more weight, she'd be forced to do the unthinkable. Let's just say if social services get involved in our lives, they could decide that Julia is an unfit mother and put Edward into foster care. And I cannot allow that to happen, Dad, under any circumstances. Otter Barry's eyes widened. This does not sound like the Julia I know, he said. He sounded completely confounded. That woman has always wanted to be a mother. More than anything else in the world. It was all she could ever talk about. I remember she told me once she wanted to have a litter of children. So for her to uncharacteristically abandon her children like this is shameful, to say the very least. But I'm sure there is an innocent explanation for all of this. Don't you worry about Edward, son. I'll put some meat on those bones of his for you. You go back home and speak to your wife. Find out what really is going on with her. Maybe she can shed some light on why she's been so disconnected towards little Edward. I think it would be wise for you to take Julia to see a doctor, to see what's going on with her. Maybe you should hire a nanny or an au pair to help her with the twins. Maybe she feels as if she's been swallowed alive, and she simply can't cope. Some people can become incredibly overwhelmed by responsibility. Their personalities can dramatically change. They can become cantankerous, cranky, and exceedingly unpleasant to be around. If it makes you feel any better, son, let's just say after you were born, your mother had her less than glamorous moments, when she got quite riled up at times. I realized, of course, that she was exhausted, being awoken at all hours of the night to attend to your needs. You were a demanding baby, crying all the time, and of course the colic you had only made things a whole lot worse." "Good Lord," said Wayne Barry, looking quite disturbed by this revelation. "I had no idea that I was a nightmare as a baby. Mum never told me about that. Well, you know your mother. She wouldn't want to upset you. But if you want to know the truth, you were hard work, son. But your mother wouldn't have changed anything for the world. You were the apple of her eye as you are mine. All I'm saying is your mother only had you. So I'm not sure how she'd have coped with twins if they'd both been as demanding as you were. So don't be too hard on your wife. As I was saying, maybe she's bitten off more than she can chew. She's not as young as she was when she first had little Edward. She's probably a little overwhelmed by being a mother again, especially of twins. Well, maybe you're right, Dad. I'll have to go back home and see what's going on with her. I'm sure, son, if you hire an au pair to help around the place, things will get significantly better for you. And when you've sorted things out at home, you can come back here and pick up little Edward." "Thanks, Dad. I really appreciate it," said Wayne Barry gratefully. "Any time, son, any time." Edward had stood in the doorway next to his grandfather, watching his father drive away in his Alfa Romeo, until his car was all but a dot on the horizon. Grandpa Otter turned around to smile warmly at his grandson. "Well, it's good to see you, Edward, after so many years. You've grown up into a fine young man. You and I are going to have the time of our lives out here. I'm very appreciative of your company. So tell me, what do you think of Canada?" Edward glanced out at the prepossessing view that stretched out before him and said, "It's very beautiful, Grandpa Otter. The views here are really lovely." "Why do you think I moved to this part of the world in the first place, son? Let me tell you, when your grandmother died, I was completely lost. I came here because I knew the natural world would heal my broken heart, give my life a sense of purpose, so to speak. Of course, it doesn't mean I don't miss your grandmother terribly. Indeed, I think of her every day. But out here in the wilderness, I do feel, well, let's just say not quite so alone, if you know what I mean." "But you are alone, Grandpa Otter," Edward was quick to point out. "Well, in a manner of speaking, you're right, Edward. But out here with the natural world surrounding me, the indigenous wildlife, all the fauna and flora, well, I don't feel quite so alone." Edward Barry had been rather reticent towards staying with Grandpa Otter, but his grandfather had made him feel so warmly welcome. Together they had gone fishing, hiking, hunting, and exploring together. Edward was enjoying himself at the cabin, so much so that he didn't want to leave. It would seem that time was going by very quickly. Grandpa Otter was larger than life, with a colourful personality, which was why he wore the brightest, most colourful shirts to complement his gregarious character. It seemed to Edward strange that someone with such a hearty sense of humour, like Grandpa Otter so clearly had, that he enjoyed living out in the wilderness all on his own. Grandpa Otter had taken Edward to the local town, and everywhere they went people had stopped to speak to Grandpa Otter, for he was well liked by the local community, and everybody was equally as delighted to meet little Edward and to welcome him to Canada. Edward could not help but think that Grandpa Otter's bright, cheerful Hawaiian shirts clashed with the scenery, and were so dramatic you'd likely spot him a mile away. Grandpa Otter told Edward lots of stories about his late grandmother, and every time he mentioned her, his face would light up like a Christmas tree. Edward felt decidedly sorry for his grandfather, because he'd lost his wife, and he wondered what it would have been like to have known his grandmother. Grandpa Otter really was an excellent cook, and he made the most delicious hearty stews that Edward had ever tasted. There was now a healthy glow to his complexion, and his clothes no longer hung off him in rags. Edward was glad to be away from his mother, but he thought about her often enough, wondering if the demon that resided inside her was getting worse or not. He really believed that if Zara Witchen had not visited their house that fateful day, to call up that entity to help his mother become pregnant, that he would still have the mother he loved in his life, but now she had become a different person altogether. One day after Edward had spent the afternoon fishing at the stream with Grandpa Otter and catching several decent-sized rainbow trout, which had been cooked on a griddle for dinner and served with butter and garlic, so it melted on the tongue. "Well," said Grandpa Otter, rubbing his stomach, "that was very good fish, was it not? But I hate to say this, Edward, you look dead beat. You're very tired, I can see. It's the mountain air, it does it to you. It can make you sleep like a baby. I think you better retire to bed. You can barely keep those young eyes of yours open. I think I'll turn in myself for the night. It's been a long day, but a productive one at that, given how many rainbow trout we caught at the stream." "Good night, Grandpa Otter," Edward had said, giving his grandfather a big warm hug. "Next time we go fishing at the stream, Grandpa, I'm going to catch a bigger rainbow trout than you." "Well, we'll see about that, little Edward," said Grandpa Otter, smiling at his grandson warmly. Edward returned to the spare room in the cabin, where no sooner had he brushed his teeth and put on his pyjamas, he was out like a light. He was no longer being harassed by hunger pangs that would in the past keep him wide awake late into the night. It was later during the night that Edward woke up with a start, as the bed he was sleeping in began to rock and shake violently, and then there at the end of his bed was a demon. He recognized the demonic face, the face he'd seen on his mother from time to time, the face of the thing that lived inside her. For a moment Edward was absolutely certain he must be dreaming, but when he rubbed his eyes again and again and blinked, the demonic entity was still there. It was grey, 10 foot tall, with gargantuan proportions, and such a grotesque face with bulging eyes and horns on its head. It gave Edward a huge menacing grin, showing off a full set of razor-sharp teeth, and then it said, "I told you you couldn't get away from me. I've come to get you." Edward stared at this hideously vile thing that had fully manifested before him in abject horror. His mouth dropped open wide like a Venus flytrap, for he had never beheld anything in his life this grotesquely evil. The thing that had been living inside his mother was now after him, and had made that clear. It had come all the way to the Blue Mountains in Canada, as if distance for it was of no significance at all. Before Edward could do anything, the beast was now on top of him, thrusting him down forcefully onto the bed. His big hands were around Edward's neck, and he began to squeeze and squeeze. Edward was gasping for breath as he tried to shake this monstrous beast off him, but the creature was so huge and so powerful that Edward just could not stand up to him. He could feel the oxygen being sucked out of his lungs, and he was sure he was about to die. "You're mine!" came the deep guttural voice. "You're mine!" For a second the demon let go of its tight stranglehold over Edward, and in that brief moment Edward let out a loud, ear-piercing scream that caused the entire cabin to rock. Indeed, he screamed so loudly that his grandfather came rushing into the bedroom to see what was going on. Edward's screams had shaken the entire cabin and thrust Otter Barry out of a deep, contented sleep. "What is it, Edward? Are you having a nightmare, son? It's nothing to worry about. I've had them before myself." Edward continued to shake like a leaf. He didn't answer his grandfather, but pointed to the corner of the room, his eyes so wide with terror, his body quivering like a blancmange jelly. "It's over there! It's over there!" he said, tears spilling down his cheeks. "It was living in my mother. Now it wants to live in me." Edward continued to shake, pointing again to the corner of the room, where Otter Barry focused his attention, and suddenly he saw a dark mist swirling around and around, and he could smell the repugnant stench of death and decay that seemed to have stolen away the room's fresh air. "What the hell is that?" said Otter Barry, staring in bemusement at the swirling mist that began to take shape. The demon once again manifested itself, this time before Grandpa Otter, who began to make the sign of the cross and pray the Lord's Prayer, demanding the demon to leave at once in the name of Jesus. The demon hissed at Grandpa Otter, grinning maliciously, but then disappeared in a wisp of smoky vapour. And then a loud wind manifested itself in the cabin. The curtains billowed, everything shook violently, and then the demonic entity was gone, leaving behind the most pungent scent that did not appear to abate. Grandpa Otter was naturally concerned about what had just transpired. He looked unduly disquieted, for he had seen the demon with his own naked eyes. It was over hot, steaming mugs of cocoa that Edward told his grandfather about the witch, who called herself Zara Witchen, who had visited their kitchen one sunny afternoon, and how she had performed rituals with his mother and 2 friends, and how they'd sat around the kitchen table in the darkness with 7 lighted candles, chanting incantations and calling up a demon called Mammon, in order for his mother to fall pregnant. "What on earth was your mother thinking, inviting the strange woman into her house that is heavily involved in the occult? You don't mess with things like that," said Grandpa Otter disapprovingly. "Your mother is an intelligent woman. Doesn't she realize if you play with fire you're going to get burnt?"
"But she wasn't playing with fire, Grandpa Otter. They lit candles, that's all, and then they performed rituals and cast spells so that my mother could fall pregnant. But they didn't play with any fire. Not that I saw, anyway."
"I wasn't meaning that, son. When I say your mother was playing with fire, what I'm saying is she was very foolish to do what she did. What happened next? I need you to tell me everything. Otherwise, I won't be able to help you fix this problem. The demon has been in our cabin. We got rid of it for the moment, but it's likely to come back. It seems to be after you, son, for some reason. So everything you can tell me, son, will be enormously helpful."
"Mammy wanted to get pregnant, as I was saying. But the witch called Zara Witchen, who came to the house, told Mum that they had to call up Mammon, and Mammon would make her pregnant. And it worked. I could see the demon was in the witch, but now that same demon lives in my mother. That's why she became so horrible."
"Well, it certainly explains a lot. Don't panic, son. The thing that possessed your mother will not possess you. I won't allow that to happen. We are going to sort this out once and for all. I have a plan. I know someone who may be able to help us. I will call him over to the cabin this evening. He will know exactly what needs to be done." That evening Edward and his grandfather were standing together on the wraparound porch. Grandpa Otter began to whistle 3 times, and then he let out 2 owl hoots that sounded like the real thing, and Edward sensed he was calling someone, but who, he couldn't imagine. It was cool outside the cabin, with the cold mountain air whipping against their faces, punnelling their clothes ever so slightly. Edward shivered because it was a tad cold, but Grandpa Otter didn't appear to notice the temperature at all. He was still wearing his flamingo shirt with the short sleeves, and goose pumps had broken out on his arms. The full moon lit the night sky with a generous light, serenaded by hundreds and thousands of glittering stars. Everything was serenely quiet, apart from, of course, the trills of the crickets and frogs, along with the distant hoot of the occasional owl. Just when Edward was sure that nobody was coming, or no one had responded to his grandfather's call, he suddenly noticed a discernible movement in the trees, as branches began to shake rather vigorously, and then an ambiguous, shadowy, tall, lofty form began to glide towards them. Edward could not comprehend exactly what he was seeing. The thing that moved towards them was a human being, but not exactly human, more like a giant-sized man that was completely covered in dark flowing hair. Edward had never seen a human being that looked like this before, but Grandpa Otter was to tell him later the creature was known as a wild man or a Bigfoot. Moments later the wild man was standing on the wraparound porch, and then Edward had to peer right up at him because he was so tall, possibly 9 foot, and had the biggest, most ponderous shoulders and feet that Edward had ever seen. He wore a leather necklace around his neck. There was a pendant attached to the necklace, along with 3 eagle's feathers. He wore a matching band on his hairy arm. The wild man spoke in a strange language that Edward could not understand, but his grandfather appeared to understand everything he was saying. The wild man nodded his head as he was speaking to Grandpa Otter. Then he said something, and then Grandpa Otter nodded his head in return and invited the wild man into the cabin. The wild man was so incredibly tall, he had to bend his head and position his body at a specific angle to crawl into the cabin, which made Edward giggle. It was then that Grandpa Otter turned to Edward. "My friend tells me the demon in our cabin is called Mammon, the spirit of gluttony. He said he could feel the demon's presence from miles away, all the way back in the woods. He said he saw the dark energy swaddling our entire cabin." Edward stood in the bedroom next to his grandfather as the wild man finally entered the room. He pointed to the corner of the room where the demon had manifested itself the previous night. Once again the Bigfoot spoke some solemn words to Otter Barry, and Otter told his grandson exactly what his friend had told him. "My friend here is telling me that the demon is here in the room, over in that same corner we saw him in earlier. But he's not physically manifested, for he's trying to hide in plain sight. He knew I was inviting my friend over, and he knows he's going to be thrown out of this cabin and back to the depths of hell from whence he came. My friend here says that the demon was invited to help your mother, I believe, fall pregnant, and in exchange for her pregnancy, in having 2 babies, he wanted to possess your soul, Edward, but your mother told him to possess her instead, for she wanted no harm to come upon you, which is why your mother has been behaving so strangely since the twins were born, and even before that, because she has been possessed by Mammon. He is a very greedy spirit. That's why he's the spirit of gluttony. He can never have enough to satisfy his unquenchable appetite, and possessing your mother was not enough. In time, he hoped to possess your whole family, especially you. He came to the cabin to possess you, while he is still possessing your mother, for he can be in multiple places at once when needs must. But he didn't know when he came here that his powers would be challenged." Edward watched as the wild man's voice boomed. He ordered the demon to reveal himself. All of a sudden the demon did just that, manifesting itself before Edward, his grandfather, and the wild man. Edward began to shake like a leaf when the demon revealed himself again, but the wild man appeared not to be intimidated by it at all, which brought Edward a measure of calm, especially when he realized the wild man seemed to know exactly what he was doing, and seemed to have some kind of authority over the demon. Gone was the look of self-satisfied smugness on the demon's face, for his grotesquely evil face shuddered as the Bigfoot pointed a finger at one of the walls in Edward's room. All of a sudden, Edward's room began to change dramatically. Everything went into black and white dots, rather like a television when it's on the blink. Edward couldn't comprehend why the demon was suddenly beginning to scream, and then he saw the wall was swirling like ripples in a large body of water, and in the centre of the wall appeared a long tunnel. It was like the wild man had suddenly opened up a portal into another world or realm. A purple mist developed. It swirled around and around in circles, projecting a powerful magnetic force, which caused even Edward's bed and the dresser in his bedroom to rattle precariously. Edward could feel a windy current emanating from the portal, and it beat obtrusively against his face. The demon's eyes went from a dark, menacing black colour to a fiery, indignant red. He roared objectionably at the wild man, who kept chanting a mantra that was making him more and more incensed, almost as if the wild man was throwing holy water at him that was physically burning him. This disgusting, grotesque, repugnant vision of depravity cried out in pain every time the wild man spoke a single word. It was almost as if every word the wild man uttered was like a burning red coal being flung directly at the demon's face. Soon the tortuous pain of the wild man's words became all too much, and the demon's resistance appeared to crumble, almost as if it was admitting defeat. The wild man began to point directly at the portal. He said some more powerful words that made the tunnel in the wall become larger and larger, like a great big opening jaw that was very much alive and was throbbing and pulsating and seemed eager to swallow the demon whole. Edward and his grandfather were holding onto the bedpost with all their might and strength to anchor their weight to the floor, as the whole bedroom had become like a gateway to another world or realm. And then it happened very suddenly. A loud suction sound, like a powerful industrial hoover, entered the room. And then the demon, screaming loudly, was sucked down the long vortex like a dead, discarded insect. The opening to the portal bulged as it sucked the demon down the long tunnel with a whizzing sound. The wall to Edward's room began to change. It became like a TV on the blink, giving Edward the distinct impression that the wall in his bedroom was not completely solid. But as suddenly and as dramatically as things had changed, they returned quickly to normal, and everything went quiet and serene again, and there was peace in the cabin. This time the wild man turned around to talk to Edward, who wondered why he was talking directly to him, for he knew he would be unlikely to understand a single word that the wild man uttered. But when the wild man spoke to him, the words seemed to enter his head and change into English, like a direct translation code. "I have sent the demon Mammon back to the bowels of hell, to where he belongs. He can no longer harm you, young man. Your mother, you will be glad to know, has also been relieved of her possession. Mammon no longer has any legal hold over her or over you. I have made your family forget about this unfortunate event. I have sent a veil of forgetfulness to all those that have been touched by Mammon's disruptive behavior that has caused much damage in its wake, for some things are just best not remembered." "I don't know how to thank you for all of this," said Otter Barry. "I knew you would be able to help me, like you helped me when I arrived here in Canada, when you told me my wife was watching over me. I was so broken up in those days, so desperately broken up, so completely lost. But you told me that my wife was watching over me. You told me that my wife was near. And you knew things about her that nobody could possibly have known, because you have the ability to tap into the unseen worlds. And since I met you, I've had my life given back to me. But now you've done more than that. You've given my son back his wife. You've delivered my grandson Edward from this demonic stronghold that was about to overcome him. How can I ever repay you?" "It was necessary to intervene," said the wild man. "I could see the darkness swaddling your cabin, and I knew that demon needed to be dealt with. I did what was necessary." The wild man was looking at Edward now, his dark eyes filled with a genuine concern, an obvious kindness. "I will not take away your memory, young man, of what happened here, for you must teach others not to mess with what they do not understand." The wild man patted Grandpa Otter on his back with an affectionate familiarity and said, "By the way, talking about if you want to pay me back in kind, well, some of that peanut butter you give me on occasion, that would be very nice." "Consider it done, my friend," said Otter Barry, breaking out into a laugh. He knew all too well the wild man's weakness towards peanut butter. Soon Edward and his grandfather were watching the wild man leave the cabin and retreating into the heart of the woods. It was only years later that Edward would realize that his grandfather's special friend was known as a Bigfoot. Edward spent one more carefree, very relaxing week with his beloved grandfather in his cabin, until both his mother and father came to collect him. In his father's Alfa Romeo, there was no hint in his parents' demeanour to ever suggest that they had ever been at loggerheads with each other. Instead, they looked like the loving, devoted couple that they had always been before the twins were born. It really was like going back in time, before Zara Witchen had come to the Barry household and everything had gone badly awry. It was almost as if none of those things had ever transpired, as if those horrifying events had been washed away with a power hose, to be remembered no more. And what could be better than that? Edward's mother ran towards him, embracing him warmly with a big effusive hug. "Oh, it's so good to see you, darling. We've missed you so much, your father and I. And so have the twins. They've missed their big brother, that's for sure. How did you enjoy your break with your grandpa, Otter? We knew sending you away would be a great opportunity for you to get to know your grandfather better." Edward looked at his mother for any trace of the ugly thing that had resided inside her, but he realized with great delight it was long gone. He had his beloved mother back. "I had a lovely time, Mum, a great time. We went fishing and exploring and hunting," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "It was the best time ever." Finally, when he did say his goodbyes to Grandpa Otter, his grandfather whispered in his ear, "I'm going to miss you, little Edward. It's been a pleasure having you to stay with me. You know you can come to the cabin to stay here with me any time you like. You're always welcome. But you must remember your parents won't remember a single thing about the discord that erupted between the two of them, due to that demon that possessed your mother. The wild man thought it was for the best that they should forget everything, so he wiped their memories clean, which I think is a good thing. Only you and I will know about it, what really happened. But let's keep it that way, shall we?" "Yes, Grandpa Otter. I won't say a single thing," said Edward in a quiet voice. "Good boy," said Grandpa Otter, slapping him affectionately on the back. "Make sure you come and see me soon, Edward." Edward nodded, thanking his grandfather for an unforgettable holiday that he knew he would never ever forget. By all accounts, the wild man had promised his parents would have no memory of the event that had caused so much chaos in their lives, so life did indeed continue as normal, almost as if there had been no disruption, no hiccups along the way. It would seem Wayne Barry seemed to idolize his wife more than ever, and was constantly saying that he was the luckiest man in the entire world to have married Julia Barry. Edward grew very fond of the twins, who were no longer screaming the house down, but grew up to be calm and very well-behaved little children. Edward became very close to them, and was a very protective older brother. The long and the short of this rather extraordinary story is that Edward ended up having a very contented, happy and fulfilled childhood, but he never did forget the demon that Zara Witchen had called up into the kitchen on that inauspicious day, a demon who had demanded Edward's very soul in exchange for his mother being pregnant, a price that Julia Barry was simply not prepared to pay. So instead she agreed to give up her soul instead, for there is no greater love than that of a mother. The demon Mammon was the spirit of greed, and he had brought so much havoc into the Barry household, robbing the Barrys of their loving relationship, and Edward's mother of her nurturing spirit. But that was now all thankfully in the past, and things had happily returned to normal again, and Edward couldn't have asked for anything more than that. It would seem even his neighbour, Alice Weinstein, had no memory of the half-starved young boy that she'd caught eating biscuits out of her dumpster, and his mother's friend Angie and Lisa, who had fallen out with her, were now back in her life, as if they'd never left, for the memory of their fallout had been magically expunged, as if it hadn't happened at all. Or if it did, it was in a parallel reality. The tea parties naturally resumed, and Edward once asked Angie what had happened to Zara Witchen. Angie had looked at him with a puzzled expression on her face. "Zara Witchen? What are you talking about, Edward? I'm sorry, I've never heard of her before. I don't know who you're talking about. But remember, your dog Bo went missing. Zara Witchen helped you find his whereabouts." "My dog Bo did go missing, Edward," said Angie. "You're right about that. But no Zara Witchen helped me. It was the farmer next door who helped me. He told me that Bo had fallen down a hole in his buttercup field, so I went over to his house to collect him." Edward looked at Angie bemused, realizing that everyone had forgotten the events that had led to his mother being possessed by a demon. Even his mother's own dentist had forgotten he'd kicked her out of his surgery. But Edward realised that this was all for the best. When he was 12 years old, he did actually see Zara Witchen. She was visiting one of those mystical stores and was buying tarot cards and some strange-looking tinctures. Zara had walked straight past little Edward, not even giving him a second glance, but he knew exactly who she was and suspected she was still caught up in the world of witchcraft, for she was wearing the same dress she had worn the very day she had visited his mother. Edward realised that the wild man obviously possessed many of those spiritual attributes that a shaman has, but there was no doubt in his mind that the wild man had outer-worldly abilities that had terrified the demon half to death. The wild man had the power to get rid of demons, open up portals into other realms, and wipe memories clean in order to bring about healing. Edward was very, very glad that he never forgot this very memorable event in his young life, for the wild man had told him remembering this would serve him well, so he could teach others not to mess around with things you don't understand. And over the years, that is what Edward has done, preaching in local churches and schools about the extreme dangers of messing around with the occult. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.